Before we see how Harry's discovery of the Marauder's map changes everything, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and whether you've ever felt like someone was watching your every move. Harry's about to learn that feeling was more real than he ever imagined. The summer before Harry Potter's 10th birthday began like every other summer at No. 4 Privet Drive. Aunt Petunia's shrill voice pierced the morning air as she rattled off an impossibly long list of chores, each task designed to keep him busy and out of sight. Uncle Vernon grunted his approval from behind his newspaper, occasionally adding threats about what would happen if Harry so much as breathed wrong while the Masons were visiting for dinner. Harry had learned years ago that resistance only made things worse. The small boy with messy black hair and startling green eyes simply nodded at each instruction, his face carefully blank. Clean the cupboard under the stairs. Weed the garden. Polish the car until it gleamed. Scrub the bathroom tiles with a toothbrush. The list went on and on. But today felt different somehow. There was an electric tension in the air that made Harry's skin prickle and his scar itch in an oddly familiar way. He couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen, though he couldn't imagine what that might be in his thoroughly mundane existence. The cupboard under the stairs had been Harry's bedroom for as long as he could remember, a cramped space barely large enough for his thin mattress and a few threadbare blankets. Spiders were his most frequent companions, along with the occasional mouse that skittered across his feet in the dark. The Dursleys had moved him to Dudley's second bedroom after the letters from Hogwarts started arriving, but they had never bothered to clean out the accumulated detritus of years. As Harry began pulling out boxes of forgotten Christmas decorations and broken appliances, he discovered items he had never seen before tucked away in the deepest corners. A tarnished silver locket that wouldn't open. A leather journal with pages that seemed to resist his attempts to read them. And then, wedged behind a fallen board, something that made his heart skip a beat. A battered trunk, its leather corners worn smooth by time and handling. The brass fittings had turned green with age, but Harry could still make out initials carved into the lid. J.P. and L.E. his parents, James Potter and Lily Evans. Harry's hands trembled as he dragged the trunk into the dim light filtering through the cupboard door. This was the first thing he had ever found that had belonged to his parents, the first tangible connection to the life that had been stolen from him. The Dursleys had told him his parents died in a car crash, that they had been worthless drunks who left nothing behind but debt and embarrassment. But deep in his heart, Harry had always known there was more to the story. The trunk's lock had long since rusted away, and the lid opened with a protesting groan that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. Inside, Harry found clothes that smelled faintly of lavender, and something else he couldn't identify, something that made him feel safe and loved in a way he had never experienced. There were photographs, too, moving pictures that made Harry gasp in wonder and confusion. In one photograph, a young man with messy hair identical to Harry's own was laughing as he chased a snitch around a Quidditch pitch. In another, a beautiful woman with Harry's green eyes was reading a book, occasionally looking up to smile at whoever was taking the picture. They looked so young, so happy, so alive. Nothing like the tragic failures the Dursleys had described, but it was what lay beneath the clothes and photographs that would change Harry's life forever. The parchment looked ancient and ordinary, yellowed with age, and folded carefully into quarters. When Harry first touched it, nothing happened. It felt like any other piece of old paper, though something about its texture seemed unusual. As he unfolded it, he expected to find a letter, or perhaps some kind of document. Instead, he found what appeared to be a completely blank sheet of parchment. Harry frowned, turning the parchment over in his hands. Why would his parents keep a blank piece of paper? He held it up to the light, wondering if there was invisible ink that might reveal hidden words. Nothing. Just blank, cream-colored parchment that seemed to have absorbed decades of careful handling. From upstairs came the sound of Aunt Petunia's voice, sharp with irritation. She was calling for him, no doubt ready to inspect his work and find fault with whatever he had accomplished. Harry knew he should return the trunk to its hiding place and hurry upstairs before his aunt's displeasure turned into something worse. But he couldn't bring himself to let go of the parchment. Instead, he found himself whispering to the empty page, his voice barely audible even to his own ears. "I wish you could tell me about my parents. I wish you could tell me who they really were." The words felt foolish even as he spoke them. Talking to a blank piece of paper was exactly the sort of freakish behavior that earned him days without meals and extra chores. But something deep inside him, some instinct he couldn't name, told him that this parchment was more than it seemed. As if responding to his desperate wish, the paper grew warm in his hands. Harry nearly dropped it in surprise, then watched in amazement as words began to appear across the surface in elegant, flowing script. Messrs. Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, purveyors of aids to magical mischief-makers, are proud to present the Marauder's map. Harry's breath caught in his throat. Magic! Real magic, happening right in his hands. The words continued to appear, as if written by an invisible quill. "To the worthy heir of our legacy, place your hand upon this parchment and speak the words, 'I solemnly swear that I am up to no good.' But beware, young Potter, for knowledge once gained cannot be unknown." The parchment knew his name. It knew he was a Potter. Harry's heart hammered against his ribs as he followed the instructions, his voice stronger now, with growing wonder and determination. "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." The transformation was immediate and breathtaking. Lines began spreading across the parchment, like ink dropped into water, flowing and branching until they formed the outline of a massive castle surrounded by grounds that stretched farther than Harry could have imagined. Details filled themselves in with magical precision: towers and turrets, courtyards and corridors, a vast lake, and a dark forest that seemed to whisper with hidden secrets. But it was the tiny dots moving throughout the castle that truly captured Harry's attention. Each dot was labelled with a name in the same elegant script: Minerva McGonagall, Severus Snape, Argus Filch. Names that meant nothing to Harry but seemed to pulse with significance. And there, in the largest tower, a dot labelled Albus Dumbledore. Harry stared at the map in wonder, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, the place from the letters that had terrorized the Dursleys and led to his brief relocation to Dudley's bedroom. But how could his parents have possessed a magical map of a school he hadn't even known existed until those letters arrived? The answer came to him with sudden, brilliant clarity. His parents had been magical. They had been wizards, not the pathetic failures the Dursleys had described. They had attended Hogwarts, and somehow they had created this incredible map that showed every corner of the magical school. Harry traced the lines of the map with one finger, marveling at the detail and craftsmanship. He could see students moving through corridors, teachers in their offices, and what appeared to be various magical creatures inhabiting the grounds. The map was alive with movement and possibility, a window into a world that should have been his birthright. But as Harry continued to explore the map, his wonder began to mix with confusion. If his parents were magical, if they had attended Hogwarts, then why was he living with the Dursleys? Why had no one from this magical world ever contacted him before the letters started arriving? Why had he been left to suffer in ignorance for 9 miserable years? And then Harry noticed something that made his blood run cold. The map didn't just show Hogwarts. As his attention shifted to the edges of the parchment, he realized that the magical chart could display other locations as well. Somehow, his desperate desire to understand his situation had caused the map to expand its view, showing him places beyond the castle walls. There, clearly labelled in the now familiar script, was Privet Drive. Harry's hands shook as he stared at the representation of his neighbourhood. Number 4 was marked clearly, along with the surrounding houses. And there, just 2 streets over, was a dot labelled Arabella Figg. Mrs. Figg, the eccentric cat lady who occasionally babysat Harry when the Dursleys went out. Harry had always found her slightly odd, with her tendency to mutter under her breath, and her cats that seemed unusually intelligent. But according to the map, she was more than just an eccentric neighbour. She was magical. Harry's mind raced as implications crashed over him like waves. Mrs. Fig was magical, and she lived close enough to watch his house. She babysat him regularly, which meant she had been observing him for years. But why? What interest could a magical person have in a boy who had been told he was nothing special? Unless he was special. Unless the Dursleys had been lying about far more than just his parents' death. As Harry continued to study the map, more disturbing details emerged. There were other magical signatures around Privet Drive, people whose names he didn't recognize, but whose positions seemed deliberately chosen. Mundungus Fletcher was stationed at the end of the street. Someone named Kingsley Shacklebolt was positioned 3 blocks away in what appeared to be a parked car. The pattern was unmistakable once Harry recognized it for what it was. He was being watched, constantly, carefully, by multiple magical people who had been positioned around his neighborhood like sentries. The realization hit Harry with the force of a physical blow. Every aspect of his life that he had assumed was random or coincidental suddenly took on new meaning. Mrs. Fig's frequent availability for babysitting, the way certain problems at school seemed to resolve themselves without explanation, the odd sense he sometimes had that someone was watching him from the shadows. He hadn't been imagining it. Someone really had been watching him, multiple someones for years. But who had arranged this surveillance? And why? Harry's attention returned to the map of Hogwarts, to the dot labelled Albus Dumbledore, moving slowly through what appeared to be the headmaster's office. Even Harry, with his limited exposure to the magical world, recognized that name. Dumbledore was the one who had sent the Hogwarts letters. Dumbledore was the headmaster of the school his parents had attended. Dumbledore was the one who had left him with the Dursleys. The pieces began to fall into place with horrible clarity. Dumbledore knew where Harry was living. Dumbledore had arranged for magical people to watch over him. Dumbledore was the one with the power and authority to organize such an elaborate surveillance network, which meant Dumbledore was the one who had chosen to leave Harry with people who despised and mistreated him, while maintaining just enough oversight to ensure he survived. Harry's hands clenched into fists around the edges of the map. The magical world knew where he was. They had always known. They could have rescued him at any time, could have brought him to people who would love and care for him, instead of treat him like an unwanted burden. But they hadn't. Instead, they had watched him suffer for 9 years, content to observe from a distance, while he endured neglect, verbal abuse, and the crushing loneliness of believing he was completely alone in the world. The sound of footsteps on the stairs above broke through Harry's spiraling thoughts. Aunt Petunia was coming to check on his progress, and if she found him sitting idle among his parents' belongings, the consequences would be severe. With careful hands, Harry refolded the map and slipped it inside his oversized t-shirt, against his chest, where it would be hidden, but close. The parchment had gone blank again, looking like nothing more than an old piece of paper. But Harry could feel it against his skin, warm with magical potential. This was his inheritance, his connection to parents who had been so much more than the Dursleys had ever told him. And it was his window into a world that had abandoned him, but never stopped watching. As Harry hastily shoved the other items back into the trunk and returned it to its hiding place, his mind was already racing with plans. The map had shown him that he was magical, that he came from magical people, and that powerful individuals in the magical world had been monitoring his life for years. But they had done so while leaving him in misery, which meant their motives were not necessarily aligned with his well-being. Harry Potter had spent 9 years believing he was powerless, friendless, and alone. But the Marauder's map had shown him that none of those things were true. He was the heir to a magical legacy. He had a tool that could reveal secrets others thought hidden. And he was being watched by people who had underestimated what a 9-year-old boy might be capable of learning. When Aunt Petunia's sharp voice called down into the cupboard, demanding to know what was taking so long, Harry emerged with the same carefully neutral expression he always wore. But behind his green eyes, something had fundamentally changed. He knew who he was now. He knew he was being watched. And he was going to find out exactly why the magical world had chosen to let him suffer while maintaining such a careful surveillance. The game, as the map's creators might have said, was afoot. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter had hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of a child wishing for rescue, but the quiet, dangerous hope of someone who had discovered he possessed the tools to rescue himself. The Marauder's map had awakened more than just its magical properties. It had awakened something in Harry that the Dursleys had tried for years to crush, the unshakable belief that he deserved better than the life he had been given. And now he had the knowledge and the means to claim it. As Harry climbed the narrow stairs out of the cupboard, the map pressed warm against his chest. He carried with him the first real secret of his life. Not the kind of secret the Dursleys demanded, born of shame and fear, but the kind of secret that was a weapon waiting to be used. The magical world had been watching Harry Potter for 9 years, confident in their ability to control and direct his life from the shadows. They had no idea that their carefully maintained surveillance had just been turned against them by a 9-year-old boy with his father's determination, his mother's intelligence, and a magical map that revealed far more than its creators had ever intended. The boy who lived was about to become the boy who knew, and that knowledge would change everything. The final phase of the magical establishment's resistance to Harry's revolution began not with grand declarations or public confrontations, but with something far more personal and devastating. They came for the children who had stood with him. The coordinated raids began at dawn across 17 different countries simultaneously, a level of international cooperation that would have been impressive if it had been directed toward any legitimate law enforcement purpose. Instead, it was focused on recapturing the magical children whose testimonies had exposed decades of systematic abuse and were now threatening to bring down the entire structure of magical governance. Harry learned about the raids through emergency communications from the Goblin Intelligence Network that had been monitoring magical government communications since the Coalition's legal challenges had begun. The reports were fragmentary and terrifying. Safe houses breached by teams of magical law enforcement officers acting under emergency authority. Children taken into protective custody for their own safety. Legal guardians appointed by magical courts to ensure the children's welfare, while investigations into their treatment by foreign extremists proceeded. Luna Lovegood had been taken from the sanctuary, where she had been recovering from years of magical suppression. Her father arrested as an enemy of magical society, whose conspiracy theories had endangered his own daughter's mental health. Neville Longbottom had been retrieved by his grandmother, who had been convinced by ministry officials that her grandson was being held against his will by international criminals seeking to use him for anti-British propaganda. Most heartbreaking of all, several of the youngest children had been subjected to immediate memory modifications designed to erase their recollections of the abuse they had suffered and the support they had received from Harry's coalition. By the time the raids were complete, those children would have no memory of ever being rescued, no understanding of why they had briefly lived in strange places with kind adults who treated them with respect and dignity. The message was clear and brutal. Continued resistance would result not just in Harry's own destruction, but in the systematic erasure of every child who had trusted him with their stories and their safety. But if magical authorities expected Harry to be paralyzed by guilt and despair over the consequences his actions had brought to other children, they had fundamentally misunderstood both his character and his strategic thinking. "They've just proven everything we've accused them of," Harry told the Emergency Coalition leadership meeting that convened within hours of the raids. "They've demonstrated that they consider magical children to be property that can be seized, manipulated, and controlled whenever it's politically convenient. They've shown that they're willing to commit crimes against children in broad daylight and call it law enforcement." Harry's calm analysis of the raids surprised adults who had expected him to be devastated by the setback. Instead, he seemed energized by proof that magical authorities were exactly as corrupt and ruthless as the Coalition had claimed. More importantly, Harry continued, they've just made it impossible for anyone to claim that this is about protecting children or maintaining social stability. You don't protect children by kidnapping them. You don't maintain stability by erasing people's memories of their own experiences. The raids had indeed backfired spectacularly in terms of public relations and political legitimacy. Even magical practitioners who had been skeptical of Harry's claims found it difficult to defend the sight of magical law enforcement officers dragging terrified children away from people who had been caring for them. The use of memory modification on children as young as 6 years old shocked even magical government supporters who had previously accepted such practices when they were conducted secretly. But the raids had also achieved their primary tactical objective. They had deprived Harry's coalition of its most powerful evidence and most compelling witnesses. Without the children's direct testimony, proving systematic abuse became much more difficult. Without their ongoing recovery from magical suppression, demonstrating the effects of such abuse became nearly impossible. The legal challenges that had been moving forward in multiple international courts suddenly faced evidentiary problems that threatened to derail the entire case. Memory-modified children could not testify about experiences they no longer remembered. Children held in government custody could not provide statements that contradicted official narratives about their treatment and welfare. Harry's response to this legal crisis demonstrated why Dumbledore had been so determined to keep him weak and dependent for so many years. Rather than accepting the setback or attempting to work around the evidentiary problems through conventional legal means, Harry proposed a solution that was both brilliant and completely outside the boundaries of normal magical jurisprudence. "We don't need the children's testimony," Harry announced during a strategy session that included legal advocates from a dozen different magical jurisdictions. "We have something better. We have a magical artifact that recorded everything." The Marauder's map, Harry explained, had been documenting not just the locations and movements of the surveillance network, but also the magical signatures and communications associated with their activities. More importantly, the map's creators had built into it protections against exactly the kind of memory modification and evidence tampering that magical authorities were now attempting. "The map doesn't just show what happened," Harry said as he activated the parchment and directed it to display the historical record of the raids. "It shows what really happened in a way that can't be altered or erased by memory charms or political pressure." The map's testimony was devastating to magical government claims about the raids. It showed clearly that the children had been taken by force from people who were caring for them properly. It documented the use of memory modification spells on children who had been showing clear signs of recovery from previous trauma. Most damaging of all, it recorded the communications between raid leaders that revealed their true motives had nothing to do with child welfare and everything to do with suppressing evidence of government crimes. But the map provided more than just evidence of the raids themselves. Harry had discovered that its temporal functions could be used to create comprehensive documentation of the entire history of magical government abuse, extending back decades and involving hundreds of officials across multiple countries. "This is the complete record," Harry told Director Ravencroft, as they reviewed the map's revelations in a secured location that even goblin detection methods couldn't penetrate. Every suppression enchantment placed on a magical child, every memory modification performed to cover up abuse, every surveillance operation conducted without proper authorization, every death that resulted from magical government policies designed to control rather than protect. The documentation was so comprehensive and so undeniable that it fundamentally changed the legal landscape surrounding Harry's case. Rather than being forced to prove specific instances of abuse using testimony that could be challenged or discredited, the Coalition could now present a complete historical record that demonstrated systematic patterns of criminal behavior extending across generations of magical governance. More importantly, the map's evidence proved that the current crisis was not an aberration or an overreaction to Harry's challenges, but rather the logical culmination of decades of increasingly authoritarian policies that had been building toward exactly this kind of open conflict between magical governments and their own citizens. The International Court of Magical Justice's response to the new evidence was swift and unprecedented. Emergency sessions were called to review documentation that proved magical governments in multiple countries had been systematically violating international law for decades. Arrest warrants were issued for hundreds of magical officials, including some of the most senior figures in European magical politics. But perhaps most significantly, the court issued injunctions requiring the immediate reversal of all memory modifications performed on the rescued children and the restoration of their ability to testify about their experiences freely and without government interference. The legal victory was comprehensive, but Harry understood that court orders were meaningless unless they could be enforced against magical governments that had already demonstrated their willingness to ignore international law when it conflicted with their political interests. That was when Dumbledore himself finally emerged from the shadows where he had been orchestrating resistance to Harry's challenges and chose to make his final stand. The confrontation Harry had been expecting for months finally came in the form of a formal challenge issued through traditional magical communication methods. Dumbledore, acting in his capacity as Chief Warlock of the British Wizengamot and Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, demanded a binding magical duel to resolve the questions surrounding Harry's allegations and the legitimacy of the magical government's authority. Under ancient magical law that predated most modern legal systems, such challenges could not be refused when issued by someone of Dumbledore's authority to someone who had made public accusations against magical governance. The duel would be conducted under truth-binding enchantments that would make deception impossible, and the outcome would be legally binding on all parties, regardless of previous court decisions or political arrangements. Harry's advisors were nearly unanimous in recommending that he refuse the challenge on grounds that he was still a minor and should not be subjected to such procedures regardless of the legal technicalities involved. But Harry understood something that his well-meaning protectors did not. Dumbledore would never have issued such a challenge unless he was confident of victory, which meant he possessed resources or knowledge that could overcome even the comprehensive evidence the coalition had assembled. More importantly, Harry realized that accepting the challenge provided an opportunity to end the conflict definitively, rather than allowing it to drag on for years through legal proceedings that magical governments would continue to obstruct and undermine. "I'll accept his challenge," Harry announced, despite the protests of everyone around him. "But not under the terms he's proposing." Instead of a traditional magical duel focused on demonstrating superior power or authority, Harry proposed what he termed a truth revelation, a magical procedure that would allow both participants to present their complete knowledge and understanding of the issues in dispute while under binding enchantments that made deception impossible. If Professor Dumbledore truly believes that his actions were justified and that his authority is legitimate, Harry said in his formal response to the challenge, then he should have no objection to a procedure that will allow everyone to see the complete truth about what he has done and why he has done it. The terms Harry proposed were far more demanding than what Dumbledore had suggested. Rather than a private duel between two individuals, Harry wanted a public revelation conducted before representatives of every major magical government and species, with the proceedings recorded by magical means that could be reviewed by anyone interested in the outcomes. Dumbledore's initial response was to reject Harry's counterproposal as unnecessarily theatrical and potentially dangerous to individuals whose legitimate security concerns required some degree of confidentiality. But Harry had anticipated such objections and was prepared for them. "The only security that requires confidentiality," Harry replied in a statement distributed through goblin communication networks that reached every magical community in the world, "is the security of officials who have committed crimes and fear exposure of their activities. If Professor Dumbledore's actions were truly justified by legitimate security concerns, then revealing them publicly will vindicate his decisions and demonstrate that his critics were wrong. The challenge Harry presented was elegantly simple and completely unanswerable. Either Dumbledore would submit to the public truth revelation and prove his innocence, or he would refuse and prove his guilt through his unwillingness to allow scrutiny of his actions. The magical world waited to see how the man who had been revered as its greatest leader would respond to a challenge from the child whose life he had systematically destroyed in pursuit of what he claimed was the greater good. Harry Potter had spent months building toward this moment, gathering evidence and allies and legal authority that would allow him to force a final confrontation with the man who had tormented him. But he had also spent those months growing from a confused and angry victim into someone capable of strategic thinking that could outmaneuver even the most experienced political operator. Dumbledore had created Harry Potter through his abuse and manipulation. He was about to discover that he had created exactly the kind of opponent he had been trying to prevent. Someone with the knowledge, resources, and absolute determination necessary to hold him accountable for every crime he had committed against magical children. The war between Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore was finally going to be settled through the one method that Dumbledore could not manipulate, control, or deflect: the complete and public revelation of the truth about everything both of them had done, and why they had done it. And Harry Potter, armed with evidence that proved decades of systematic abuse, and supported by a coalition that represented the interests of every magical being who had ever suffered under authoritarian magical governance, was absolutely certain that the truth would vindicate everything he had fought for and destroy everything that Dumbledore represented. The Great Hall of the International Confederation of Wizards had never hosted an event like the truth revelation that would determine the fate of magical governance across the globe. Representatives from every magical government, species, council, and international organization had gathered to witness what promised to be either the vindication of decades of magical leadership or the complete exposure of systematic corruption that extended to the highest levels of magical society. Harry arrived at the proceedings with a calm confidence that surprised even his closest advisors. After months of legal battles, political maneuvering, and strategic planning, he was finally going to have the opportunity to present the complete truth about what had been done to him and countless other magical children. More importantly, he was going to force Albus Dumbledore to reveal the true motivations behind policies that had tortured and killed children in the name of protecting magical society. The hall itself had been configured with magical protocols that made deception impossible within its boundaries. Truth-binding enchantments woven into the very stones ensured that every word spoken would be accurate to the speaker's knowledge and understanding. Memory-revealing charms allowed observers to see not just what participants claimed had happened, but their actual recollections of events as they had experienced them. Most significantly, the proceedings were being recorded by magical means that would preserve every detail for review by anyone interested in understanding exactly what had transpired during the decades of abuse that Harry's case had exposed. Dumbledore entered the hall with the dignified bearing that had characterized his public appearances for generations, but Harry could see signs of strain that suggested the months of investigation and legal pressure had taken their toll on even his formidable composure. The man who had once commanded universal respect and admiration now faced an audience that included many people who had been forced to confront uncomfortable questions about their own complicity in the systems he had created. The proceedings began with formal presentations of the evidence that had been assembled over months of investigation. Director Ravencroft presented the International Confederation's findings about systematic violations of magical children's rights. Chieftain Ragnarok detailed the Goblin Nation's documentation of magical government corruption extending back centuries. Elena Vasquez outlined the legal framework that made such violations crimes against magical humanity under international law. But it was when Harry himself took the podium to present his personal testimony that the true scope of what had been done became clear to observers who had previously understood the case only through legal documents and bureaucratic reports. Harry began his presentation by activating the Marauder's map and projecting its revelations for the entire assembly to see. The magical signatures of the surveillance network around Privet Drive appeared in three-dimensional detail above the podium, showing not just the positions and movements of his watchers, but also the magical communications they had sent, reporting on his activities to Dumbledore and other officials. "This is what my childhood looked like, from the perspective of the people who claimed to be protecting me," Harry said, his young voice carrying clearly through the enchanted hall. "Every moment of privacy I thought I had was an illusion. Every interaction I believed was genuine was being observed and reported. Every sign of magical development I displayed was being documented and suppressed." The map expanded to show the binding enchantments that had been placed on Harry's magical abilities, the complex web of spells designed to keep him weak, ignorant, and dependent on the very people who were systematically abusing him. The assembled observers could see the sophistication and cruelty of magic that had been used to torture a child while disguising that torture as protection. "But the surveillance and suppression were just the beginning," Harry continued, directing the map to display the broader network of operations that extended across magical Britain and beyond. The same techniques that were used on me were being applied to dozens of other magical children, and the same officials who authorized my abuse were coordinating similar programs in multiple countries. The map's revelations about the international scope of the conspiracy drew gasps of horror from observers who were seeing for the first time the true extent of what their governments had been doing in the name of magical security and child welfare. Children as young as 4 years old had been subjected to magical torture that left them psychologically damaged and magically crippled. Families had been torn apart through memory modifications that made parents forget they had ever had magical children who posed inconvenient questions about official policies. Most damning of all, the map showed the deaths that had resulted from the suppression program, the magical children who had died when their magical cores collapsed under the strain of enchantments designed to contain power that was too strong to be safely suppressed. Timothy and Miranda Clearwater were 5 and 7 years old when they died, Harry said, the map displaying the final moments of children who had been killed by procedures authorized by officials sitting in the very hall where their deaths were now being revealed. Their crime was having older sister who asked too many questions about magical theory. Their punishment was death by magical torture, administered by people who convinced their parents it was medical treatment necessary for their own safety. The silence that followed Harry's presentation was broken only by the sounds of observers struggling to process the magnitude of what they had witnessed. The evidence was so comprehensive and so horrifying that it left no room for the kinds of rationalization and justification that had previously allowed magical society to ignore or minimize the abuses being committed in their name. But Harry was not finished. "Everything I've shown you is documented fact, supported by magical evidence that cannot be disputed or altered," he said, his attention turning to Dumbledore, who had remained silent throughout the presentation. "But what we haven't heard yet is why these crimes were committed. What justified torturing and killing magical children? What threat was so serious that it required the systematic abuse of the very people magical society claims to protect? The challenge was direct and unanswerable through conventional political deflection. Under the truth-binding enchantments that governed the proceedings, Dumbledore would be forced to reveal his actual motivations rather than the comfortable lies he had told magical society for decades. Dumbledore rose to respond with the careful dignity that had served him well throughout his long career. But Harry could see that the older wizard was struggling with the knowledge that every word he spoke would be subjected to magical verification of its honesty and accuracy. "Harry," Dumbledore began, his voice carrying the grandfatherly warmth that had charmed countless witches and wizards over the years, "I understand that you feel wronged by decisions that were made regarding your upbringing and the treatment of other magical children. but you must understand that these decisions were made in response to threats that you are too young to fully comprehend. The truth-binding enchantments immediately revealed the deception embedded in Dumbledore's carefully chosen words. Magical indicators throughout the hall began glowing with colors that showed the assembled observers exactly which portions of his statement were accurate and which were attempts to mislead or manipulate. Harry had been prepared for such evasions, and his response demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made him such an effective opponent for someone of Dumbledore's experience and cunning. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said, "could you please specify exactly which threats required the torture of magical children as a defensive measure? Could you identify the enemies that were so dangerous that killing 5-year-old Miranda Clearwater was a necessary response? Could you explain the strategic advantage that was gained by magically suppressing the abilities of dozens of magical children across multiple countries?" Each question was precisely crafted to force Dumbledore into either admitting that no such threats existed or revealing information that would expose the true scope of the conspiracy he had been orchestrating. Dumbledore's response revealed why he had been so reluctant to submit to the truth revelation that Harry had demanded. "The threats were not external, Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice heavy with what might have been genuine regret. "They were internal. The magical world has always been vulnerable to individuals whose power and independence made them dangerous to the stability of our society. The measures we took were designed to prevent the emergence of magical practitioners who might use their abilities to destabilize or destroy the systems that protect our civilization from chaos." The admission was devastating in its honesty and its implications. Dumbledore had not been protecting magical children from external enemies. He had been protecting magical society from the children themselves, systematically identifying and neutralizing young magical practitioners who might grow up to challenge the authority of people like himself. But Harry pressed for more specific information about how such decisions had been made and implemented. "Professor, could you explain the criteria that were used to determine which magical children posed such threats to society that they required suppression or elimination? Could you identify the officials who participated in these decisions? Could you describe the legal authority under which these programs were implemented?" Dumbledore's answers revealed a conspiracy that was even more extensive and systematic than Harry's evidence had suggested. The identification of dangerous magical children was based not on any objective assessment of threat, but on political criteria designed to ensure that future generations of magical practitioners would be dependent on and subservient to existing authority structures. Children whose families had histories of political independence were targeted regardless of their individual characteristics or abilities. Children who displayed unusual magical talents that might allow them to detect or counter government surveillance and manipulation were subjected to suppression procedures that often proved fatal. Most disturbing of all, children who showed signs of the kind of moral clarity and intellectual integrity that might lead them to question official policies were systematically identified and eliminated before they could reach adulthood. The program had not been designed to protect magical society from external threats or even from genuinely dangerous individuals. It had been designed to prevent the emergence of anyone capable of challenging the corrupt systems that people like Dumbledore had created to maintain their own power and authority. "So you're admitting," Harry said, "that you tortured and killed magical children, not because they had done anything wrong, but because you were afraid they might grow up to oppose your authority?" Dumbledore's response was the final piece of evidence that Harry needed to prove his case beyond any possible doubt. "Yes," Dumbledore said, the truth-binding enchantments making dissimulation impossible. "The greater good sometimes requires sacrifices that seem cruel when viewed from a limited perspective. The children who were subjected to these procedures were tragic casualties in a larger struggle to preserve magical civilization from those who would destroy it through naive idealism and dangerous independence." The reaction from the assembled observers was immediate and overwhelming. Representatives from magical governments that had participated in the conspiracy began demanding explanations from their own officials. Species councils that had been marginalized for centuries saw confirmation that their suspicions about human magical governance had been completely justified. International law enforcement agencies began coordinating immediate arrests of officials whose participation in the conspiracy had just been publicly confirmed. But perhaps the most significant response came from the magical practitioners who had previously supported Dumbledore and the systems he represented. Faced with undeniable evidence that their leaders had been systematically murdering children to prevent challenges to their authority, even the most loyal supporters of magical governance began questioning whether such systems deserved to exist at all. Harry watched the chaos unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness that reflected his understanding of what victory in such a conflict actually meant. He had succeeded in exposing the truth about magical government corruption and in holding specific officials accountable for their crimes. But he had also destroyed the comfortable illusions that had allowed magical society to function without confronting the authoritarian foundations of their civilization. The truth revelation had achieved everything Harry had hoped for in terms of justice and accountability. But it had also created a crisis of legitimacy for magical governance that would require completely rebuilding magical society according to principles that actually protected the rights and dignity of all magical beings. As magical law enforcement officials began arresting Dumbledore and hundreds of other officials whose participation in the conspiracy had been documented during the proceedings, Harry felt the weight of responsibility that came with having initiated changes that would affect every aspect of magical life for generations to come. The boy who had been tortured by people claiming to protect him had proven that those people were exactly as corrupt and dangerous as their actions had suggested. But he had also inherited responsibility for ensuring that whatever replaced their systems would be better rather than simply different. Harry Potter had won his war against Albus Dumbledore and the magical establishment that had enabled his crimes. Now he would have to help build a magical world worthy of the sacrifices that victory had required from everyone who had fought alongside him. The confrontation that had begun with a 9-year-old boy discovering a magical map in his parents' trunk had ended with the exposure and destruction of corruption that had infected magical governance for generations. But the real work of creating a just and sustainable magical society was only beginning, and Harry Potter, despite his youth, would be expected to play a central role in determining what that society would become. The war for Harry Potter's freedom had become a revolution that would reshape magical civilization itself. And the boy who had started that revolution by refusing to accept that his suffering was justified would now have the opportunity to ensure that no other magical child would ever again be sacrificed for the convenience of adults who mistook power for wisdom and authority for legitimacy. 2 years after the truth revelation that had exposed decades of magical government corruption and ended Albus Dumbledore's reign of authoritarian control, Harry Potter stood in the gardens of the newly established International Academy for Magical Rights, watching a group of young magical practitioners learn defensive spells from instructors who had volunteered their time to ensure no magical child would ever again be left defenseless against those who would abuse them. The Academy represented everything Harry had fought for during his war against magical authority, a place where magical children could learn not just spells and potions, but their rights under magical law and the skills necessary to protect themselves from manipulation and coercion. It was funded through a combination of reparations payments from governments found guilty of systematic abuse and voluntary contributions from magical practitioners who had been inspired by the revelations to support genuine reform. But perhaps most importantly, it was run according to principles that treated magical children as individuals with inherent rights and dignity, rather than as resources to be molded according to adult preferences and political convenience. Harry had just celebrated his 12th birthday, though the years since his discovery of the Marauder's map had aged him in ways that had little to do with simple chronology. The boy, who had once been desperate for any adult to care about his welfare, now found himself in the position of advising international committees on magical children's rights and serving as a symbolic figure for reform movements that extended far beyond the specific abuses he had personally experienced. The transformation had not been easy, either for Harry himself or for the magical world that had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems they had accepted without question for generations. But as Harry watched students practice spells that could detect memory modifications and counter magical compulsion, he felt a deep satisfaction that came from knowing his suffering had been transformed into protection for other children who might otherwise have faced similar fates. The Academy's current enrollment included many of the children who had been rescued from various suppression programs during the investigation that followed Harry's revelations. Luna Lovegood was thriving under educational approaches that valued her unique magical perceptions rather than attempting to suppress them. Neville Longbottom had blossomed into a confident young wizard, once freed from the enchantments that had been designed to destroy his self-esteem and magical development. Most significantly, children who had been subjected to memory modifications during the government raids were recovering their suppressed memories and processing the trauma they had experienced with the support of counselors who specialized in magical psychological abuse. The healing process was slow and sometimes painful, but it was guided by principles that respected each child's autonomy and right to understand their own experiences rather than accepting convenient lies about what had been done to them. Harry's own healing had followed a similar pattern, though his recovery had been complicated by his ongoing role as a public figure and advocate for magical rights reform. He had chosen to continue his education at the academy he had helped establish, both because it provided the kind of individualized magical instruction that allowed him to develop his abilities without artificial constraints, and because his presence there demonstrated the institution's commitment to serving all magical children, regardless of their fame or political significance. The Marauder's map remained one of Harry's most treasured possessions, though its role in his life had evolved considerably since the desperate days when it had been his only window into the truth about his circumstances. The map now served primarily as a teaching tool, helping instructors demonstrate the kinds of surveillance and manipulation techniques that magical children needed to recognize and resist. It also continued to document ongoing violations of magical rights around the world, providing evidence for new investigations and legal challenges as the reform movement expanded into countries that had not yet faced accountability for their treatment of magical minorities. But perhaps most meaningfully, the map had become a symbol of the connection between Harry and the parents he had never known, but who had somehow anticipated the exact challenges he would face and provided him with the tools necessary to overcome them. James and Lily Potter's legacy lived on not just in their son's survival and success, but in the principles of justice and protection that guided the institutions he had helped create. The broader magical world had undergone changes that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of authoritarian control. Magical governments across Europe had been forced to implement comprehensive reforms that established independent oversight of all policies affecting magical children. International monitoring systems ensured that no child could be subjected to magical suppression, memory modification, or other forms of abuse without immediate detection and intervention. More fundamentally, the revelations about systematic government corruption had sparked a broader reckoning with the authoritarian tendencies that had characterized magical governance for centuries. Democratic reforms had been implemented that gave magical practitioners real voice in the policies that affected their lives. Transparency requirements had been established that prevented officials from operating in the shadows where abuse could flourish without oversight. The Goblin nations had parlayed their support for Harry's cause into comprehensive treaty renegotiations that established them as equal partners in magical commerce and governance, rather than subordinate service providers. House elf liberation had become a reality through legal frameworks that protected magical servants from abuse, while respecting their cultural preferences for service relationships that were freely chosen and fairly compensated. Centaur territories had been formally recognized as autonomous regions with their own governance systems, ending centuries of encroachment and marginalization. Even vampire and werewolf communities had achieved legal protections and social acceptance that would have been unthinkable during the era of systematic discrimination and persecution. But Harry understood that institutional change, however comprehensive, was only as strong as the commitment of individuals to maintain and protect it. The systems that had enabled decades of abuse had not emerged overnight, and the systems that had replaced them would require constant vigilance and ongoing activism to prevent corruption from taking root again. That understanding had led Harry to make a decision that surprised many of his advisors and supporters. Rather than pursuing a conventional magical education that would prepare him for a career in magical government or international affairs, he had chosen to focus his studies on magical child advocacy and the kinds of direct service that would keep him connected to the communities most vulnerable to the kinds of abuse he had experienced. Harry's daily routine at the academy reflected this commitment. His mornings were spent in advanced magical studies that would prepare him to detect and counter the sophisticated abuse techniques that future corrupt officials might develop. His afternoons were devoted to counseling training that would allow him to help other traumatized children process their experiences and develop the confidence necessary to resist manipulation. But perhaps most importantly, his evenings were spent in what the Academy called practical advocacy, working directly with magical children who were still trapped in abusive situations around the world and helping coordinate rescue operations that had become possible through the international legal frameworks his case had established. The work was demanding and sometimes heartbreaking, but it gave Harry a sense of purpose that went far beyond personal healing or political victory. Every child he helped rescue was proof that his own suffering had been transformed into something meaningful and lasting. One particular case that had occupied much of Harry's attention during recent months involved a group of magical children in Eastern Europe who were being subjected to experimental procedures designed to enhance their magical abilities through what officials claimed were voluntary medical treatments. The children's parents had been told their offspring were participating in an advanced education program that would give them opportunities unavailable through conventional magical schooling. The reality, as revealed through investigations Harry had helped coordinate, was that the children were being used as test subjects for magical enhancement techniques that were causing severe psychological damage and, in some cases, complete magical core collapse. The procedures were being conducted by officials who had previously participated in suppression programs, but had shifted to enhancement research after the international crackdowns that followed Harry's revelations. Harry's response to the situation demonstrated how much his understanding of advocacy and systemic change had evolved since his initial confrontation with Dumbledore. Rather than simply exposing the abuse and demanding immediate rescue operations, he had worked with international legal authorities to build a comprehensive case that would not only save the current victims, but also establish legal precedents that would prevent similar programs from being established elsewhere. The case had required months of careful investigation, diplomatic negotiation, and legal maneuvering, but it had ultimately resulted in the rescue of 17 children and the prosecution of dozens of officials whose participation in illegal medical experimentation had violated multiple international treaties. More importantly, the legal frameworks established during the case had created new protections for magical children that extended beyond traditional abuse scenarios to include any situation where children might be subjected to experimental procedures or enhanced education programs that posed risks to their physical or psychological welfare. Harry's role in such cases had evolved far beyond that of a victim sharing his experiences or a symbol inspiring others to action. He had become a skilled advocate whose combination of personal experience, magical abilities, and strategic thinking made him uniquely effective at identifying, investigating, and prosecuting complex abuse cases that might otherwise have remained hidden from international oversight. But Harry's greatest contribution to magical rights reform was not his individual advocacy work, however successful. It was his ongoing demonstration that children who had been victimized by authority figures could grow into adults capable of holding those authority figures accountable while building better systems to protect future generations. The academy that bore Harry's name had become a model for magical education institutions around the world, proving that it was possible to provide rigorous magical instruction while respecting students' autonomy and protecting their rights. Graduates of the academy were pursuing careers in magical law enforcement, education, healing, and advocacy, with a shared commitment to ensuring that the kinds of systematic abuse Harry had exposed would never again be tolerated in magical society. Perhaps most significantly, many academy graduates were themselves survivors of various forms of magical abuse who had been inspired by Harry's example to transform their own trauma into tools for protecting others. The academy had become not just a school, but a movement, generating new generations of magical practitioners who understood that authority required constant scrutiny and that rights required eternal vigilance to maintain. As Harry watched the current students practice defensive spells in the academy gardens, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from a desperate 9-year-old discovering a magical map to a young advocate whose work was helping reshape magical civilization itself. The path had been difficult and sometimes dangerous, but it had led to changes that would protect magical children for generations to come. The Marauder's map that had started everything lay open on a bench beside Harry, no longer displaying surveillance networks or documenting government abuse, but instead showing the locations of magical children around the world who were safe, protected, and free to develop their abilities without fear of suppression or manipulation. The map that had once revealed Harry's imprisonment now revealed the liberation of countless others who would never experience what he had endured. Harry Potter had discovered more than just a magical inheritance when he found his father's map in the cupboard under the stairs. He had discovered his own power to challenge injustice, his own capacity to transform suffering into strength, and his own ability to inspire others to demand better from the systems that governed their lives. The boy who had lived had become the man who changed everything, proving that even the most elaborate systems of control could be defeated by someone who refused to accept that their suffering was justified by any greater good. And as the sun set over the academy where magical children learned to protect themselves and each other, Harry Potter knew that the most important battles of his life lay not in the past he had overcome, but in the future he was helping to build for every magical child who would come after him. The war for Harry Potter's freedom had ended in victory. The work of ensuring that such wars would never again be necessary was just beginning, and Harry Potter, surrounded by students who shared his commitment to justice and protection, was exactly where he belonged. Not as a victim of magical authority, but as a guardian, ensuring that magical authority would never again be able to victimize anyone. Harry's journey from a monitored child to an independent young wizard shows us the power of knowledge and courage. What moments in this story resonated most with you? Share in the comments which part of Harry's fight for independence inspired you the most. The 3 days that followed Harry's discovery of the Marauder's map passed in a haze of carefully controlled excitement and growing unease. To anyone watching, he maintained his usual routine of chores and silent compliance, but every spare moment was devoted to understanding the magical inheritance that had literally fallen into his hands. Harry quickly learned that the map responded to his emotional state as much as his conscious commands. When he felt frustrated or angry, which happened frequently as he processed the implications of what he had discovered, the map would shift to show the surveillance network around Privet Drive. When he felt curious about his parents, it would display areas of Hogwarts where their names appeared in faded script along the corridors, as if the very stones remembered their presence. The parchment had become his most treasured possession, hidden carefully in a loose floorboard beneath his thin mattress. During the long hours when the Dursleys thought he was sleeping, Harry would unfold the map by the dim light filtering through his small window and lose himself in its revelations. Each exploration taught him something new about the magical world and his place in it, but also deepened his understanding of just how thoroughly his life had been orchestrated by others. Mrs. Fig, Harry discovered, was not simply living nearby by coincidence. The map showed magical signatures that allowed him to trace her movements over time, and the pattern was unmistakable. Every day, she positioned herself where she could observe number 4 Privet Drive. When Harry was forced to spend time in the garden, she would find reasons to work in her own yard or walk her cats along the street. When the Dursleys left him alone in the house, she would take up residence on her front steps with a cup of tea and one of her enormous cats. The realization that his occasional babysitter had been a magical spy all along left Harry feeling hollow and betrayed. He remembered the countless afternoons spent in her stuffy house, listening to her ramble about her cats while the smell of cabbage permeated everything. She had known exactly who and what he was, had known about the magical world he was being denied, and had said nothing. More disturbing still was the discovery that Mrs. Fig was not the only watcher. As Harry learned to manipulate the map's temporal functions, he began to see the true scope of the surveillance network. Mundungus Fletcher, whose name appeared regularly at the end of Privet Drive, had been maintaining his post for at least 3 years, according to the magical signatures Harry could trace. The man seemed to favor the abandoned house at the corner, though he occasionally moved to different vantage points, depending on some schedule Harry couldn't yet decipher. Then there was Kingsley Shacklebolt, whose magical signature appeared with clockwork regularity every Tuesday and Friday evening, always in a different car parked at different locations around the neighborhood. Sometimes he was at the grocery store car park 3 blocks away, sometimes outside the primary school, but always positioned where he could observe the approaches to Privet Drive. The pattern suggested a level of organization and resources that made Harry's stomach clench with anxiety. This wasn't a casual arrangement or a favor between friends. This was a professional surveillance operation, complete with shift rotations and contingency positions. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery came when Harry learned to push the map's abilities beyond simple observation. On his 4th night with the parchment, driven by a mixture of curiosity and growing anger, he found himself concentrating intensely on Mrs. Fig's dot while whispering a question to the map. What is she really doing? The response was immediate and chilling. Text appeared near Mrs. Fig's position, as if the map were providing a running commentary on her activities. Subject remains contained within acceptable parameters. No signs of accidental magic in past 72 hours. Recommend continued passive observation. Monthly report due to AD within the week. A D. Albus Dumbledore. Harry stared at the text until it faded, his hands trembling slightly. The map was not simply showing him Mrs. Fig's location, it was somehow accessing the magical communications she was sending to Dumbledore about Harry's behavior and activities. He was not just being watched, he was being studied, catalogued, and reported on like some kind of experimental subject. The knowledge hit Harry like a physical blow, leaving him gasping for breath in the darkness of his cramped room. Every aspect of his life that he had thought was private, every small moment of freedom he had imagined he possessed, had been an illusion. Mrs. Fig had been documenting his behavior, noting his magical incidents, and sending regular reports to the man who had condemned him to this existence. With growing dread, Harry began to systematically explore what information the map could provide about each of his watchers. The results painted a picture that made him feel sick with betrayal and rage. Mundungus Fletcher, according to the magical text that appeared when Harry concentrated on his signature, was documenting Harry's physical condition and any signs of magical development. His reports to Dumbledore included detailed observations about Harry's health, his interactions with the Dursleys, and his apparent ignorance of his magical heritage. Kingsley Shacklebolt was monitoring external threats and ensuring that no unauthorized magical individuals approached Harry's location. His reports focused on maintaining the security of Harry's placement and preventing any interference from what the map cryptically referred to as hostile elements. But it was the discovery of additional watchers that truly shattered Harry's remaining illusions about his life. Teacher replacements. The map revealed that 3 of Harry's primary school teachers over the years had possessed magical signatures, indicating they were not Muggles as they appeared. Miss Peterson, who had taught his Year 2 class, and had been unusually kind to Harry despite his reputation for freakish accidents. Mr. Whitmore, who had supervised him during several lunch detentions, and had always seemed to know when Harry was being picked on by other students, and Mrs. Clark, the school nurse, who had treated Harry's various injuries over the years, and had asked surprisingly perceptive questions about his home life. All of them magical, all of them reporting to Dumbledore. The pattern extended beyond the school. The map showed magical signatures associated with several shopkeepers in Little Whinging, people Harry had encountered regularly during errands for the Dursleys. The pharmacist who had always been helpful when Harry came in to collect Dudley's prescriptions. The librarian who had never questioned why a young boy spent so many hours reading alone in the corner during school holidays. Even the postman who delivered mail to Privet Drive showed the telltale magical signature that indicated his true nature. Harry's entire world had been populated with spies. The scope of the deception was breathtaking in its thoroughness and horrifying in its implications. Dumbledore had not simply placed Harry with the Dursleys and forgotten about him. He had constructed an elaborate network of magical surveillance that monitored every aspect of Harry's existence while maintaining the pretense that he was living an ordinary Muggle life. But why? What could possibly justify such an extensive operation to watch one small boy? As Harry delved deeper into the map's capabilities, he began to find answers that only raised more disturbing questions. The magical text that appeared when he concentrated on his own signature was unlike anything he had seen for the other Watchers. Primary subject. Magical signature suppressed but stable. Blood protection holding. No signs of premature awakening. Containment protocols remain effective. Special monitoring required until Hogwarts age. Containment protocols. The words echoed in Harry's mind as their implications sank in. He was not being protected or cared for. He was being contained, like some dangerous animal that might pose a threat if allowed to roam freely. And his magical signature was being suppressed. Harry had always known he was different, had experienced strange things that the Dursleys punished him for, but never explained. Glass that vanished when he was angry. Hair that grew back overnight after Petunia cut it too short. The time he had somehow ended up on the school roof without any memory of how he got there. The Dursleys called these incidents freakish accidents and punished him severely for each one. But according to the map, they were signs of magical ability that was being deliberately suppressed. The revelation filled Harry with a cold rage that was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not only had Dumbledore condemned him to a life of neglect and abuse, but he had actively worked to prevent Harry from accessing his own magical heritage. The suppression explained why his magical incidents were so random and uncontrolled, why he could never repeat them deliberately, why he had never been able to defend himself properly against Dudley and his gang. His magic was there, but it was being held back by deliberate interference. Harry spent the rest of the night experimenting with the map's temporal functions, tracing the history of his surveillance back as far as the magical signatures could reach. What he discovered was a carefully planned operation that had been in place since he was a baby. Mrs. Figg had been positioned in the neighborhood before Harry arrived at the Dursleys. The magical teachers had been placed in the local schools years in advance, ready to monitor him when he reached school age. Even the local shopkeepers had been gradually replaced with magical operatives over the course of several years, creating a comprehensive network that ensured no aspect of Harry's life went unobserved. The level of planning and resources required for such an operation was staggering. Dumbledore had not simply made arrangements for Harry's care. He had restructured an entire Muggle neighborhood to serve as an elaborate prison disguised as a normal life. But the most chilling discovery came when Harry pushed the map to its limits, trying to understand the full scope of the surveillance network. As he concentrated intensely on finding any other magical signatures in the area, The map revealed something that made his blood run cold. The Dursleys themselves were being monitored. Vernon and Petunia Dursley did not possess magical signatures, but they were surrounded by enchantments that Harry could see as faint tracery across the map. Compulsion charms that encouraged them to keep Harry hidden and discouraged them from asking too many questions about their nephew. Memory modifications that had removed their recollections of specific incidents or conversations that might have led them to seek outside help. Even Dudley, Harry realized with growing horror, had been subject to magical interference. The boy's natural cruelty toward Harry had been enhanced by subtle influence spells that made him more aggressive and less likely to develop any sympathy for his cousin. The Dursleys had never chosen to treat Harry badly. Their neglect and abuse had been magically encouraged and enhanced to serve Dumbledore's purposes. Harry sat in the darkness of his small room, the map spread across his knees, and tried to process the full magnitude of what he had discovered. His entire life had been a carefully constructed lie. The people who had raised him had been magically manipulated into treating him badly. The people who had seemed kind to him had been spies reporting his every action to someone who viewed him as a subject to be contained rather than a child to be protected. And his own magical abilities had been deliberately suppressed to keep him ignorant and helpless. The betrayal was so complete, so thoroughly planned, that Harry felt something break inside him. Not break in the way that despair breaks a person, but break in the way that a dam breaks when the pressure becomes too great to contain. For 9 years, Harry had blamed himself for the way the Dursleys treated him. He had believed he was worthless, freakish, unwanted. He had accepted their contempt as justified, and their neglect as deserved. The knowledge that their treatment of him had been magically influenced should have been a relief, proof that their cruelty was not his fault. Instead, it filled him with a rage so pure and cold that it burned through him like ice. If Dumbledore could manipulate the Dursleys into abusing him, then Dumbledore could have manipulated them into loving him instead. If magical people could be placed throughout his life to watch and report, they could have been placed to help and support him. If his magical abilities could be suppressed, they could have been nurtured and developed. Every moment of pain, every instant of loneliness, every day of believing he was worthless and alone had been a deliberate choice made by someone who possessed the power to give him a different life, but had chosen not to. Harry carefully refolded the map and returned it to its hiding place, his movements precise and controlled. His mind was already working, planning, considering possibilities that would have been unthinkable just a week ago. The magical world thought they could manipulate him indefinitely, that he would remain ignorant and compliant until they decided to reveal themselves. They believed their surveillance was undetected, their control absolute. They were wrong. Harry Potter had spent 9 years being a victim of circumstances beyond his control, but the Marauder's map had given him something the architects of his prison had never intended him to possess: knowledge of their methods and the means to turn their own tools against them. The boy who had been contained was about to become the boy who contained others, and he would start with the Watchers who thought themselves so cleverly hidden in plain sight. As dawn broke over Privet Drive, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns and identical houses, Harry began to plan his first move in a game that no one else knew had begun. Mrs. Arabella Figg was about to discover that the child she had been reporting on for nearly a decade had learned to watch her in return. And unlike her reports to Dumbledore, Harry's observations would not be limited to passive documentation. The contained was about to become the container, and the Watchers were about to learn what it felt like to be watched by someone who knew exactly what they were really doing. The war for Harry Potter's freedom had begun, though only one side knew they were fighting. But that advantage would not last long, because Harry had inherited more than just his father's map. He had inherited his father's talent for mischief, his mother's fierce intelligence, and something that was entirely his own: the absolute determination of someone who had discovered that every moment of suffering in his life had been deliberately chosen by people who could have chosen differently, The Marauders had created their map to aid magical mischief makers. Their heir was about to use it for something far more serious: magical warfare against the very people who thought they controlled his destiny. And Harry Potter had no intention of losing. The morning after Harry's most devastating discoveries about the surveillance network, he woke with a clarity of purpose that felt alien after years of confused helplessness. For the first time in his life, he possessed both the knowledge and the tools necessary to take control of his situation. But knowledge without careful application was worthless, and Harry had learned enough about his Watchers to understand that any misstep could result in immediate intervention. His first priority was determining exactly how closely he was being monitored and what behaviors triggered active responses versus passive observation. If he was going to use the surveillance network against itself, he needed to understand its operational parameters with scientific precision. Harry began his testing that very morning, starting with subtle variations in his normal routine. Instead of beginning his assigned chores immediately after breakfast, he lingered at the kitchen table for an extra 5 minutes, pretending to study a piece of toast with unusual interest. Through the kitchen window, he could see Mrs. Figg's house, and he made a mental note of whether this minor deviation prompted any visible response. Nothing. Mrs. Figg continued her morning routine of hanging laundry on her line, though Harry noticed she positioned herself where she could observe the kitchen window while working. Encouraged by this lack of reaction, Harry pushed slightly further. When Aunt Petunia sent him to weed the garden, he deliberately worked more slowly than usual, stopping frequently to examine imaginary insects or peer at the sky as if watching for rain. Again, no immediate response from the visible watchers, though he detected a subtle increase in attention from Mrs. Figg, who found reasons to move around her garden with increasing frequency. The real test came when Harry decided to simulate one of his freakish accidents. During lunch, he concentrated intensely on his glass of water, while Uncle Vernon ranted about incompetent colleagues. Harry focused all his will on making the glass move, drawing on the same desperate energy that had sometimes produced magical results in the past. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as his concentration was beginning to waver, the glass shifted slightly across the table. The response was immediate and telling. Within minutes, Mrs. Figg appeared on her front step with a cup of tea, her attention fixed on number 4 with barely concealed intensity. Through the map that evening, Harry confirmed that she had sent an immediate report to Dumbledore about unusual magical activity detected at Harry's location. But more importantly, Harry discovered that his magical incident had been stronger and more controlled than any he had previously experienced. The suppression on his abilities was still present, but his newfound understanding of its existence seemed to weaken its effectiveness. Knowledge, Harry realized, was indeed a weapon against magical manipulation. Over the following days, Harry systematically tested the boundaries of acceptable behavior, while carefully monitoring the responses through the Marauder's map. He learned that minor deviations from routine were tolerated, but anything that suggested developing magical awareness triggered increased surveillance. Extended periods away from the house prompted physical searches by the Watchers. Any sign of interaction with unfamiliar adults resulted in immediate magical intervention to discourage further contact. But perhaps most significantly, Harry discovered that his Watchers were operating under strict non-interference protocols unless specific conditions were met. They were observers, not active participants, except in cases of immediate magical exposure or physical danger. This knowledge gave Harry his first real tactical advantage. As long as he appeared to remain ignorant of his magical heritage and posed no threat to the secrecy of his situation, the Watchers would continue their passive observation without direct intervention. But the moment they suspected he was becoming aware of his true circumstances, their role would shift from monitoring to active containment. Harry spent considerable time studying the map's representation of his own magical signature, learning to recognize the suppression enchantments that had been woven around him. The magic was complex and layered, designed not just to dampen his abilities, but to prevent him from recognizing their existence. It was a masterwork of subtle manipulation, the kind of advanced magic that required both tremendous skill and intimate knowledge of the target. The personal nature of the suppression filled Harry with a cold fury that he carefully controlled and channeled into productive analysis. Someone had studied him extensively to create these bindings, had observed his magical development from infancy, and crafted specific limitations designed to keep him weak and ignorant. The magic was too precise, too personally tailored to have been created by distant observation. Someone who knew him well had participated in his magical imprisonment. As Harry explored the map's temporal functions more extensively, he began to piece together the timeline of his suppression. The enchantments had been placed when he was very young, possibly as early as his first year with the Dursleys. They had been regularly reinforced and adjusted as he grew, always staying just ahead of his natural magical development. But the suppression was not perfect. Harry could see fluctuations in its effectiveness that corresponded with moments of extreme emotion or stress. The glass that had shattered when Dudley pushed him too far, the hair that regrew overnight after a particularly brutal haircut, the time he had appeared on the school roof after being chased by Dudley's gang. In each case, his emotional state had temporarily overwhelmed the magical bindings, allowing his true power to manifest briefly before being contained again. Understanding the mechanism gave Harry his first real hope of breaking free. If intense emotion could overwhelm the suppression temporarily, then perhaps sustained focus and deliberate intent could weaken it permanently. But such an attempt would be extremely dangerous, as it would almost certainly trigger the active intervention protocols he had identified. Harry needed allies, resources, and most importantly, he needed to be somewhere other than Privet Drive when he made his move. The map showed him that the magical world was vast and complex, extending far beyond the small English neighborhood where he had been imprisoned. There were magical communities in London, schools in other countries, and entire societies of witches and wizards living parallel to the Muggle world. Some of these communities, according to the magical signatures Harry could trace, had little or no connection to Dumbledore's sphere of influence. If Harry could reach one of these independent magical communities, he might be able to find help in breaking the enchantments that bound him. But first, he needed to understand exactly who had the authority to place such bindings on a child and what legal protections, if any, existed for someone in his situation. The map provided some answers, though they were not encouraging. The magical text that appeared when Harry concentrated on his own binding showed references to guardianship laws and protection protocols, suggesting that Dumbledore had legal authority over Harry that extended beyond simple custody arrangements. But the references also mentioned international oversight and appeal processes, indicating that even Dumbledore's authority had limits. Harry began to develop a comprehensive plan that would unfold in carefully orchestrated stages. First, he would continue to test and gradually weaken his magical suppression while maintaining the appearance of ignorance. Second, he would use the map to identify potential allies and resources beyond Dumbledore's control. Third, he would find a way to make contact with independent magical authorities who might be willing to investigate his situation. But the most crucial element of his plan was timing. Harry had less than 2 years before his 11th birthday, when he would be expected to attend Hogwarts and fall completely under Dumbledore's direct authority. If he was going to challenge the system that had imprisoned him, he needed to do so while he still had the element of surprise, and before his watchers realized he had discovered their existence. The first stage of Harry's plan began immediately. Each day, he would spend time in meditation-like concentration, focusing on the suppression enchantments he could sense around his magical core. Rather than fighting them directly, which would trigger immediate detection, he began the delicate work of understanding their structure and finding tiny flaws in their construction. The process was exhausting and often frustrating, but Harry's determination was fueled by years of accumulated rage and a newfound understanding of exactly how he had been wronged. Every moment of pain he had endured, every instance of feeling worthless and alone, had been deliberately orchestrated by people who possessed both the power and the knowledge to give him a different life. As the days passed, Harry began to notice subtle changes in his magical awareness. Colors seemed slightly brighter, sounds carried farther, and he occasionally caught glimpses of things that should have been hidden. The suppression was weakening incrementally, so gradually that his watchers would hopefully fail to notice until it was too late to reinforce. But even these small improvements in his magical sensitivity came with risks. Harry found himself unconsciously performing minor magic throughout the day, small manifestations of power that he had to carefully conceal from the Dursleys while monitoring whether they triggered responses from his watchers. The most dangerous incident occurred during one of Dudley's attempts to corner Harry in the garden. As his cousin raised his fist, clearly intending to demonstrate his superiority through violence, Harry felt the suppression enchantments waver under a surge of protective anger. For a brief moment, his magic flowed freely, and Dudley was suddenly lifted off his feet by an invisible force that slammed him against the garden shed. The magical release was intoxicating, a taste of the power that should have been Harry's birthright. But the immediate aftermath was terrifying. Every watcher in the area responded instantly, converging on Privet Drive with barely concealed urgency. Mrs. Figg appeared at her fence within minutes, her eyes scanning the garden with obvious concern. Mundungus Fletcher's signature moved from his usual position at the end of the street to a much closer vantage point. Most alarming of all, new magical signatures appeared on the map. Powerful individuals Harry had never detected, before arriving with obvious haste. The suppression enchantments around Harry's magic suddenly strengthened dramatically, clamping down on his abilities with painful force. Harry realized he had miscalculated badly. The Watchers were not just observing his magical development. They were prepared to intervene aggressively to maintain his containment. His brief display of uncontrolled power had triggered emergency protocols that brought additional resources to bear on his situation. For several days after the incident, Harry felt completely cut off from his magic. The suppression strengthened to levels that left him feeling hollow and disconnected from the power he had briefly touched. The Watchers maintained heightened alertness, their movements more coordinated, and their attention more focused. Additional magical signatures remained in the area, ready to respond to any further signs of magical awakening. But the incident also provided Harry with crucial intelligence about his opposition. The speed and coordination of the response revealed that his Watchers were part of a larger organization with significant resources and clear protocols for containing magical children. The immediate strengthening of his suppression showed that the enchantments could be modified remotely, suggesting they were maintained by powerful magic users with ongoing access to his magical signature. Most importantly, the reaction confirmed that Harry's growing abilities were seen as a genuine threat to the carefully constructed prison that surrounded him. If the magical community was willing to deploy such resources to prevent a 9-year-old boy from accessing his own power, it meant they feared what he might accomplish if he broke free. That fear, Harry realized, was a weapon he could use against them. Rather than being discouraged by the setback, Harry adjusted his approach to account for what he had learned. Direct confrontation with the suppression enchantments would only trigger stronger countermeasures. But the very strength of the response suggested that his opponents were operating from a position of weakness disguised as strength. If they truly believed their cause was just and their methods appropriate, they would not need such elaborate deceptions and overwhelming force to maintain control over one small boy. The extensive surveillance, the magical manipulation of his guardians, the suppression of his abilities, all pointed to people who knew their actions could not withstand scrutiny, and were therefore determined to prevent such scrutiny from ever occurring. Harry began to focus his efforts on gathering evidence rather than developing power. Using the map's ability to access magical communications, he started documenting the surveillance network with methodical precision. Names, positions, reporting schedules, the contents of messages sent to Dumbledore, and most importantly, evidence of the illegal magical interference being used to maintain his imprisonment. The picture that emerged was damning. Not only was Harry being held against his will through magical coercion of his guardians, but his watchers were violating numerous magical laws regarding the monitoring and suppression of underage magic. The casual manipulation of Muggle minds, the unauthorized placement of magical operatives in non-magical institutions, and the deliberate suppression of a magical child's abilities all constituted serious crimes under the international magical legal codes referenced in the map's commentary. Harry carefully documented each violation, storing the information in his memory with the precision of someone who understood that his freedom might depend on his ability to present a convincing case to the right authorities. But finding those authorities would require resources and connections he did not yet possess. The solution came to Harry during one of his late-night explorations of the map's extended range. As he traced the movements of various magical individuals throughout London, he noticed that some signatures moved in patterns that suggested they were not part of Dumbledore's network. These independent magical practitioners gathered in certain locations that appeared to be neutral territory, places where different magical factions could interact without the political complications that seemed to surround Hogwarts and the Ministry of Magic. One location in particular caught Harry's attention, a pub called the Leaky Cauldron that served as an entrance to a magical shopping district. The map showed a constant flow of magical individuals from around the world, many carrying signatures that indicated no connection to British magical politics. If Harry could reach this location, he might be able to make contact with someone willing to listen to his situation without the bias of existing loyalties to Dumbledore. But reaching London without triggering the surveillance network would require careful planning and considerable risk. Harry needed to find a way to leave Privet Drive for an extended period without prompting the active intervention that would surely follow any unexplained absence. The opportunity presented itself when Uncle Vernon announced that the family would be visiting Aunt Marge for a long weekend. Normally, Harry would be left with Mrs. Figg during such trips, providing his watchers with even more direct access to monitor his activities. But Harry had been documenting the patterns of his surveillance carefully, and he knew that Mrs. Figg would be visiting her sister in Norfolk the same weekend, leaving her unavailable for babysitting duties. The Dursleys would be forced to either take Harry with them or find alternative arrangements, both of which would disrupt the carefully maintained observation protocols. If Harry played his cards correctly, he might be able to create enough confusion and misdirection to slip away undetected while his watchers scrambled to maintain surveillance in an unexpected situation. Harry began laying the groundwork for his plan immediately, using his knowledge of the Dursleys' magical manipulation to predict their likely responses to various stimuli. He started acting out in small ways that would make them reluctant to bring him along to Aunt Marge's, while simultaneously sabotaging their attempts to find alternative childcare. The beauty of the plan was that Harry's watchers, focused as they were on magical threats and his developing abilities, paid little attention to his manipulation of purely mundane circumstances. They were prepared to counter magical escapes and suppress supernatural abilities, but they had not anticipated that their target might use conventional means to achieve his objectives. As the weekend approached, Harry felt a familiar mixture of fear and excitement that reminded him of the night he had first activated the Marauder's map. Once again, he was about to cross a line that would fundamentally change his circumstances, but this time, he was not stumbling blindly into revelation. This time, Harry Potter was going to war against the people who had stolen his childhood, armed with knowledge, determination, and the unshakable conviction that he deserved better than the life they had chosen for him. The boy who had been contained was about to discover what lay beyond the walls of his carefully constructed prison. And when he returned, if he returned, the game between Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore would finally begin in earnest. The magical world had spent 9 years believing they could control Harry's destiny without his knowledge or consent. They were about to learn the difference between a prisoner who accepts his chains and one who understands exactly how those chains were forged. Harry Potter was no longer content to be the subject of other people's plans. It was time for him to start making plans of his own. The weekend of Harry's planned escape arrived with the kind of chaotic confusion he had carefully orchestrated over the previous 2 weeks. Uncle Vernon bellowed his frustration throughout Friday morning, as every childcare arrangement he had made fell through in rapid succession. Mrs. Figg was indeed visiting her sister in Norfolk, just as Harry had confirmed through the Marauder's map. The Pocus family, Dudley's usual companions in torment, had suddenly developed a mysterious stomach ailment that made them unavailable for extended babysitting. Even the paid child-minding service Uncle Vernon had reluctantly contacted had experienced an unexpected scheduling conflict. Harry maintained an expression of innocent confusion throughout the mounting crisis, occasionally offering helpful suggestions that he knew would be immediately rejected. Perhaps they could ask the neighbours? Oh, but the Hendersons were away on holiday. Maybe one of Uncle Vernon's work colleagues? Naturally, none of them would want to spend their weekend supervising a freakish nephew they had heard complained about for years. By Saturday morning, Uncle Vernon was faced with an impossible choice: cancel the long-planned visit to Aunt Marge, which would result in weeks of her vindictive displeasure, or take Harry along despite the humiliation of having to explain his presence to someone who viewed him as a shameful family burden. The solution Uncle Vernon eventually settled on was typical of the man's combination of selfishness and short-sighted thinking. He would take Harry to London first, deposit him at a day program for disadvantaged children that Dudley's school had recommended for charity work, and collect him on the way back from Aunt Marge's on Sunday evening. It would add hours to their journey and cost money Vernon begrudged spending, but it would keep Harry supervised and out of sight during the visit. Harry listened to the plan with carefully concealed elation. Uncle Vernon had just handed him exactly what he needed: a legitimate reason to be in London, unsupervised by his usual watchers, for an entire day. The day program was located in Camden, less than 3 miles from the Leaky Cauldron. More importantly, the facility was run by well-meaning muggles who would have no connection to the magical surveillance network and no way to monitor Harry's activities once he was outside their direct supervision. The drive to London on Saturday morning passed in tense silence, broken only by Uncle Vernon's muttered complaints about the inconvenience and Aunt Petunia's sharp reminders to Harry about behaving properly and not embarrassing the family. Dudley sulked in his corner of the back seat, resentful that his weekend plans had been disrupted by Harry's mere existence. Harry watched the countryside roll past through the car window, while his mind raced through the final details of his plan. The Marauder's map, carefully folded and hidden in his sock, would guide him to the magical district once he reached central London. His meagre savings, accumulated through years of finding dropped coins and completing small errands for neighbours, would hopefully be enough to purchase basic magical supplies and perhaps a meal. Most importantly, he had memorized every detail he could gather about the violations of magical law that constituted his imprisonment, ready to present his case to anyone willing to listen. The Camden Community Centre was exactly what Harry had expected: a well-intentioned but underfunded facility, where overworked volunteers tried to provide structure and enrichment for children whose families could not afford better options. The staff were kind, but harried, managing far too many children with far too few resources. They welcomed Harry with the sort of determined cheerfulness that suggested they had seen many cases like his and were committed to making the best of difficult circumstances. Harry endured the orientation process and initial activities with patient compliance, all while mentally tracking the schedules and routines that would determine when and how he could slip away unnoticed. The centre operated on a loose structure of supervised activities, interspersed with free periods when children could choose their own pursuits. During these free periods, older children were permitted to visit the small library or use the computer room unsupervised, provided they remained within the building. But Harry had noticed something during his tour that the staff had not explicitly mentioned. The building shared a back courtyard with several other community facilities, and the courtyard connected to a public park through an unlocked gate that was used for outdoor activities. A child who claimed to be visiting the library, but instead slipped through the courtyard, could easily reach the park, and from there, the broader London streets, without triggering any immediate alarm. Harry waited until the late morning free period to put his plan into action, He informed the volunteer coordinator that he wanted to spend some time reading, a request that was met with enthusiastic approval and no follow-up supervision. Once in the library, Harry verified that he was alone, then carefully made his way through the building's rear exit into the shared courtyard. The sensation of being truly unsupervised for the first time in his life was both exhilarating and terrifying. As Harry walked through the park and toward the main road, he felt the weight of years of constant observation lifting from his shoulders. No Mrs. Fig was watching from a nearby window. No magical signatures were tracking his movement on hidden maps. For the first time since infancy, Harry Potter was free to make his own choices without interference from the network of watchers who had controlled every aspect of his existence. The journey to Charing Cross Road took longer than Harry had anticipated, partly because he had to rely on asking directions from strangers, and partly because he kept stopping to stare at the bustling crowds and busy streets. London was overwhelming in its size and complexity, a vast world of possibilities that existed beyond the carefully controlled boundaries of little whinging. But it was when Harry finally located the shabby pub, squeezed between a bookshop and a record store, that his real education in the magical world began. The Leaky Cauldron looked exactly like the kind of establishment that Londoners would walk past without a second glance: dingy, narrow, and thoroughly unremarkable. But as Harry approached the entrance, the Marauder's map in his pocket grew warm, responding to the concentrated magical energy that radiated from the building, like heat from a furnace. Harry pushed through the pub's heavy door and stepped into a world that defied every assumption he had made about what lay beyond his imprisonment. The pub was crowded with people who could only be described as magical, though not in the theatrical way Harry had imagined from fairy tales and children's stories. These were ordinary-looking men and women who happened to wear robes instead of suits, who gestured with wooden sticks that sparked with coloured lights, and who discussed matters that would have sounded like absolute nonsense to Muggle ears. A witch near the bar was complaining about the difficulty of finding quality dragon hide boots in her size. Two wizards in the corner were engaged in an animated debate about the proper temperature for brewing pepper-up potions. A family with 3 young children were sharing a meal that included moving vegetables and bread that appeared to be seasoning itself. Harry stood in the doorway for several minutes, overwhelmed by the casual impossibility of everything he was witnessing. This was not the hidden world of mysterious magic users he had imagined. This was a community, a society, a complete alternate version of civilization that existed parallel to the Muggle world he had always known. And he should have been part of it from birth. The realization hit Harry with renewed force as he watched magical families interacting with the easy comfort of people living ordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances. The children at the family table were using magic as naturally as breathing, levitating their cups and changing the colors of their food with casual gestures. They were younger than Harry, but infinitely more accomplished in abilities that should have been his birthright. 9 years of his life had been stolen, not just by the Dursleys' neglect and abuse, but by his deliberate exclusion from the world where he truly belonged. Harry forced himself to move deeper into the pub, acutely aware that his Muggle clothing and obvious amazement marked him as an outsider. But rather than hostility, his presence seemed to generate mild curiosity and occasional sympathetic glances from the other patrons. An elderly witch near the fireplace smiled kindly at him and gestured toward an empty chair at her table. "First time in the magical world, dear?" she asked, in a voice that reminded Harry of the grandmother he had never known. "You have that wide-eyed look that all the Muggle-raised children get when they discover us." Harry nodded, not trusting himself to speak without revealing the complex emotions that were threatening to overwhelm him. The woman's assumption that he was simply a newly discovered magical child was both accurate and completely wrong. He was discovering the magical world for the first time, but not because he had just learned of his heritage. He was discovering it because he had been deliberately prevented from knowing it existed. "My name is Emmeline Vance," the woman continued, extending a hand that glowed briefly with warm magic when Harry shook it. "I volunteer with the Muggle-born Integration Program. We help children like you understand what it means to be magical, and how to navigate both worlds successfully. The irony of the statement was not lost on Harry. Here was someone whose job it was to help magical children integrate into wizarding society, speaking to a boy who had been systematically prevented from accessing that society by the very people who claimed to be protecting him. "What's your name, dear?" Emmeline asked. "And where are your guardians? Children your age don't usually explore Diagon Alley on their own." Harry hesitated, suddenly aware that giving his real name might trigger recognition and immediate contact with Dumbledore's network, but he also realized that this woman represented exactly what he had been hoping to find: an adult from the magical world who was not part of the conspiracy that had imprisoned him. "My name is Harry," he said carefully. "Harry Potter, and my guardians don't know I'm here." The effect of his name was immediate and dramatic. Emmeline's eyes widened with shock and recognition, and conversations at nearby tables fell silent as other patrons turned to stare at the famous scar that was barely visible beneath Harry's unruly fringe. "Harry Potter," Emmeline breathed, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and confusion. "But what are you doing here alone? Where is Professor Dumbledore? The Ministry guidelines are very clear about your protection protocols." Protection protocols. The phrase confirmed what Harry had already suspected. His imprisonment was not a secret known only to a small group of conspirators. It was official policy, implemented with the knowledge and approval of the magical government itself. "I don't know anything about protection protocols," Harry said, his voice carefully steady despite the anger building in his chest. "I know that I've been living with relatives who hate magic and hate me, and that I've been watched by people who report my every action to Professor Dumbledore without my knowledge or consent." The silence in the pub was now complete, with every patron listening intently to a conversation that clearly violated their expectations about how Harry Potter's life was supposed to be proceeding. Emmeline looked genuinely distressed, her motherly features creased with worry and confusion. "Harry, there must be some misunderstanding. Professor Dumbledore is one of the greatest wizards of our time, and he has always acted in your best interests. The placement with your relatives was for your own protection, to keep you safe from the Death Eaters who might seek revenge for their master's defeat." "Safe?" Harry's voice rose slightly, drawing even more attention from the listening crowd. "Safe from what? From people who might actually care about me? From learning about my own heritage? From developing the magical abilities I was born with?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Harry could see the doubt beginning to creep into Emmeline's expression. She was starting to realize that something was seriously wrong with the official narrative she had accepted without question. "Harry," she said slowly, "what exactly has your life been like with your relatives? Have they been teaching you about magic? Preparing you for Hogwarts?" Harry's laugh was bitter and completely without humor. "They've spent 9 years telling me that magic doesn't exist and that I'm a freak for any unusual things that happen around me. They've locked me in cupboards for displaying accidental magic and punished me for asking questions about my parents. And all the while, magical people have been watching and reporting everything to Dumbledore while doing nothing to help." The reaction from the pub's patrons was immediate and explosive. Voices rose in shock and outrage as the implications of Harry's words sank in. Someone shouted that keeping a magical child ignorant of his heritage was a violation of the International Statute on Magical Children's Rights. Another voice demanded to know how the Ministry could have approved such treatment, but it was Emmeline's response that gave Harry hope that his desperate gamble might actually succeed. "Harry," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury, "if what you're saying is true, then crimes have been committed against you that demand investigation and prosecution. The deliberate suppression of a magical child's development, the use of ignorant guardians to enforce magical containment, the surveillance without proper legal oversight, these are all serious violations of both British magical law and international magical children's rights." Harry felt a surge of vindication that was almost overwhelming. Finally, someone with knowledge of magical law was confirming what he had suspected. His treatment was not just wrong, it was illegal. "Can you help me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can you help me get away from the people who've been controlling my life?" Emmeline stood up with the decisive movement of someone who had made up her mind about a course of action. "Harry, I'm going to take you to see some people who can definitely help you. There are protections in place for magical children that supersede any custody arrangements, especially when those arrangements violate magical law. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe while proper investigations are conducted." As Emmeline led Harry toward the rear of the pub, she paused to speak quietly with the bartender, a hunchbacked man who had been following their conversation with intense interest. The man nodded gravely and reached for a communication device that looked like a cross between a telephone and a crystal ball. "Tom's going to contact some friends of mine at the International Confederation of Wizards," Emmeline explained, as they walked toward a brick wall that Harry was certain had been solid when they entered. "They specialize in cases involving magical children's rights violations, and they have authority that supersedes local magical governments when international law has been violated." Harry watched in amazement as Emmeline tapped the brick wall with her wand in a specific pattern, causing the bricks to rearrange themselves into an archway that revealed a bustling street beyond. Diagon Alley stretched before them, a magical marketplace that made the Leaky Cauldron seem mundane by comparison. The sight of witches and wizards shopping for cauldrons, books, and magical creatures filled Harry with a complex mixture of wonder and rage. This was the world he should have grown up in, the community he should have been part of from birth. Every shop, every magical interaction, every casual display of wonder represented something that had been stolen from him by people who claimed to be acting in his best interests. As they walked through the crowded street, Harry began to understand the true scope of what had been taken from him. This was not just about magic as an abstract concept or power as a tool. This was about belonging to a community, about understanding his place in the world, about having access to knowledge and opportunities that could have shaped him into someone completely different. Harry Potter could have been a confident young wizard, comfortable in both magical and mundane worlds, secure in his identity and proud of his heritage. Instead, he was a confused and angry 9-year-old who had stumbled into his birthright by accident and was only now beginning to understand the magnitude of what had been denied him. But Harry was also beginning to understand something else. The magical world was not the monolithic institution he had imagined from his observations of Dumbledore's surveillance network. There were different factions, competing authorities, and people like Emmeline who were genuinely committed to justice and children's welfare rather than political convenience. The International Confederation of Wizards, according to Emmeline's explanation as they walked, maintained offices in every major magical district, specifically to investigate violations of international magical law. They had authority to override local magical governments when those governments failed to protect magical children's rights, and they took such failures very seriously indeed. More importantly, they had the power to remove magical children from harmful situations and place them in protective custody while investigations proceeded. If Harry could convince them that his situation constituted abuse under international magical law, he might finally be free of Dumbledore's control. As they approached an imposing building marked with symbols from dozens of different magical traditions, Harry felt something he had never experienced before. Genuine hope that adults with the power to help him might actually choose to do so. The boy who had spent 9 years believing he was powerless and alone was about to discover that even the most elaborate prison could be challenged by people who understood that some things mattered more than political convenience. Harry Potter's war for his freedom was about to gain allies with the knowledge, authority, and determination necessary to take on Albus Dumbledore himself. The most powerful wizard of the age was about to discover that his carefully constructed plans could be disrupted by the simple truth that keeping magical children ignorant and isolated was a crime, regardless of how noble his intentions might have been. And Harry Potter, armed with evidence of systematic abuse and supported by people who genuinely cared about his welfare, was finally going to have the chance to tell his story to someone with the power and authority to do something about it. The offices of the International Confederation of Wizards occupied 3 floors of a building that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. As Emmeline led Harry through corridors that bent at impossible angles and past doorways that opened onto rooms clearly larger than the building could contain, he began to understand that the magical world operated by rules fundamentally different from anything he had experienced in Little Whinging. But it was the people they encountered that truly drove home the scope of what Harry had stumbled into. Witches and wizards from every corner of the globe moved through the offices with purposeful efficiency, their robes and accessories reflecting magical traditions Harry had never imagined existed. A delegation of African wizards discussed drought management spells in rapid Swahili while reviewing maps that showed rainfall patterns in real time. Asian witches demonstrated healing techniques that involved manipulating visible energy flows around their patients. European officials debated the finer points of international magical law in a mixture of languages that somehow became perfectly understandable to anyone listening. This was not the insular British magical community that Harry had glimpsed through Dumbledore's surveillance network. This was a truly global civilization, with its own governments, laws, and institutions that operated beyond the reach of any single magical authority. The office where Emmeline brought Harry belonged to Senior Investigator Marcus Blackwood, a sharp-eyed wizard whose title was embossed in gold lettering on a door that had assessed their approach and opened itself when it determined their business was urgent enough to justify interrupting his current activities. Blackwood looked up from a stack of case files as they entered, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to intense interest as he recognized the famous scar barely visible beneath Harry's unruly fringe. But rather than the awe or pity Harry had come to expect when people realized his identity, Blackwood's reaction was that of a professional investigator who had just been presented with evidence of a potentially explosive case. "Mr. Potter," Blackwood said, gesturing toward a chair that adjusted itself to Harry's size as he sat down. "Miss Vance has given me a preliminary overview of your situation, but I need to hear the details directly from you. I want you to understand that this conversation is being recorded by magical means for legal purposes, and that anything you tell me may be used in formal proceedings against those responsible for violations of magical children's rights." The formality of the statement was both intimidating and reassuring. Harry was finally being treated as someone whose experiences mattered, whose testimony would be taken seriously by people with the authority to act on it. Harry began with his earliest memories of the Dursleys, describing 9 years of systematic emotional abuse, deliberate isolation, and punishment for displaying natural magical abilities. Blackwood listened without interruption, occasionally making notes with a quill that wrote by itself while recording Harry's words in multiple languages simultaneously. But it was when Harry described his discovery of the Marauder's map and the surveillance network that Blackwood's professional composure began to crack. "You're telling me that you were able to identify multiple magical operatives conducting surveillance on your residence without their knowledge?" Blackwood asked, his tone carefully controlled. "And that these operatives were reporting your activities to Professor Dumbledore on a regular basis?" "More than that," Harry said, pulling the carefully folded map from his sock. "I can show you." The Marauder's map had never been more responsive than it was in that office, filled with concentrated magical energy. As Harry activated it with the familiar phrase, the parchment expanded to show not just Hogwarts or Privet Drive, but a comprehensive view of magical Britain that included the very building where they sat. Blackwood stared at the map in amazement as Harry demonstrated its capabilities, showing how it could trace historical positions, access magical communications, and reveal the true nature of individuals who appeared to be ordinary muggles. The map's revelation of Mrs. Figg's magical signature and her reporting schedule to Dumbledore drew a sharp intake of breath from the investigator. "This is extraordinary evidence," Blackwood murmured, studying the map's display of the surveillance network. "I've never seen magical documentation this comprehensive or this detailed. How long have you been able to use this artifact?" "About 3 weeks," Harry replied. "It belonged to my father. He helped create it when he was at Hogwarts." The implications of that statement hung in the air between them. James Potter's son had been forced to use his father's own magical creation to uncover the systematic abuse being inflicted on him by the magical community his father had died to protect. Blackwood's expression hardened as he absorbed the full scope of what Harry was showing him. "Mr. Potter, what I'm seeing here constitutes prima facie evidence of multiple violations of international magical law. The unauthorized surveillance of a magical minor, the suppression of magical development, the placement with non-magical guardians without proper oversight, and most seriously, the deliberate isolation from magical community and education." He paused, his quill hovering over his notes. "But there's something else I need to understand. You mentioned that your magical abilities have been suppressed. Can you explain what you mean by that?" Harry concentrated on the map, directing it to display his own magical signature and the complex web of enchantments that surrounded it. The visualization was more detailed than anything he had achieved before, perhaps responding to the powerful magical environment of the office, or to his growing understanding of what he was seeing. Blackwood's face went pale as he studied the display. "Dear Merlin," he whispered, "those are binding enchantments. Extremely sophisticated ones designed to suppress magical development while maintaining the appearance of normal childhood accidental magic." He stood up abruptly, beginning to pace behind his desk. "Mr. Potter, what has been done to you is not just illegal under international magical law. It's a form of magical torture, specifically prohibited by the Geneva Conventions on Magical Warfare. Those enchantments were developed during the dark wizard conflicts of the early 1900s to incapacitate captured enemy magic users." The revelation hit Harry like a physical blow. He had suspected that his magical suppression was deliberate, but learning that it constituted a form of torture banned by international treaty made the betrayal infinitely worse. "Who has the authority to place such bindings?" Harry asked, though he already suspected he knew the answer. "In Britain, only the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, or someone acting with explicit authorization from the Minister of Magic," Blackwood replied grimly, and given Professor Dumbledore's position as chief warlock, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Harry's imprisonment had not been the work of well-meaning but misguided individuals. It was a systematic program of abuse authorized at the highest levels of British magical government. Blackwood returned to his desk and activated a communication device that looked like a crystal sphere filled with swirling mist. "I need to contact the Department of Magical Child Welfare immediately. This case requires emergency intervention protocols." As Blackwood spoke rapidly with unseen colleagues, Harry found himself studying the map more intently than ever before. Now that he was in an environment where his magical abilities weren't being actively suppressed, he could see details that had been hidden from him previously. The surveillance network around Privet Drive was just the tip of a much larger operation. The map showed connections extending throughout magical Britain, linking Dumbledore's watchers to a complex hierarchy of magical officials and organizations. The Ministry of Magic, Hogwarts School, St. Mungo's Hospital, and even the goblin-run Bank Gringotts all showed signs of coordination with the surveillance operation. But most disturbing of all, the map revealed that Harry was not the only child being subjected to such treatment. Scattered across Britain were other young magical signatures, surrounded by the same type of binding enchantments that constrained Harry's abilities. Children whose names he didn't recognize, but whose circumstances appeared remarkably similar to his own. They were being watched, controlled, and isolated just as systematically as Harry had been. "Mr. Blackwood," Harry interrupted the investigator's rapid conversation, "I think you need to see this." Harry directed the map to highlight the other constrained magical signatures, and Blackwood's expression shifted from professional concern to genuine horror as he realized the implications. "There are others," Blackwood breathed. "This isn't just about you, Mr. Potter. This appears to be a systematic program affecting multiple magical children." He terminated his communication and activated a different device, one that clearly connected him to higher authorities within the International Confederation. "I need to speak with the director immediately," he said in clipped tones. "We have a Code 7 situation involving systematic abuse of magical minors by a member government." Code 7, Harry learned as he listened to the increasingly urgent conversations taking place around him, was the designation for violations of magical children's rights serious enough to trigger immediate international intervention. It was reserved for cases involving torture, systematic abuse, or the deliberate suppression of magical development by government authorities. As more officials arrived in Blackwood's office to review Harry's evidence, the scope of the investigation expanded rapidly. The map's revelations about the surveillance network led to discoveries about illegal monitoring of other magical families. The binding enchantments on Harry and the other children pointed to a coordinated program that violated multiple international treaties. Most damaging of all, the evidence suggested that the British magical government had been systematically lying to international oversight bodies about the welfare of magical children in their custody. But it was the arrival of Director Helena Ravencroft that marked the moment when Harry's personal fight for freedom became something much larger. Ravencroft was a formidable witch whose mere presence seemed to make the office's magical protections stand at attention. She reviewed Harry's evidence with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to dealing with the worst violations of magical law, and her expression grew darker with each new revelation. "Mr. Potter," she said finally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke for magical governments across the globe, "what has been done to you and these other children constitutes one of the most serious violations of international magical law we have encountered in decades. The systematic torture of magical minors, the deliberate suppression of magical development, and the coordination of these activities at the highest levels of government represent crimes that demand immediate and comprehensive intervention." She activated a communication device that Harry had not seen before, one that seemed to connect her simultaneously to magical officials around the world. "I am invoking Article 12 of the International Magical Children's Protection Act," she announced to the assembled officials. "All signatory nations are hereby notified that the British magical government stands accused of systematic violations of magical children's rights, and that immediate protective custody orders are being issued for all affected minors." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, Harry found himself surrounded by magical officials from a dozen different countries, all working with urgent efficiency to document his case and coordinate protective measures for the other children identified by the map. But the most significant development came when Ravencroft pulled Harry aside for a private conversation, away from the bustling activity filling the office. "Harry," she said, her formal tone softening slightly, "I need you to understand what happens next. We're going to remove you from the Dursleys' custody immediately, and we're going to do the same for the other children we've identified. The binding enchantments will be removed by our best curse breakers, and you'll receive proper magical education and support." Harry felt a surge of relief and gratitude that threatened to overwhelm him. After 9 years of believing he was powerless and alone, adults with real authority were finally taking action to protect him. "But," Ravencroft continued, "I also need you to understand that this case is going to become very public, very quickly. Professor Dumbledore is one of the most respected figures in the magical world, and accusing him of systematically torturing magical children is going to send shock waves throughout our community. There will be people who refuse to believe the evidence, who will claim that his actions were justified by circumstances we don't understand." She paused, studying Harry's face carefully. "You're going to be at the center of a magical political storm unlike anything our world has seen in generations. Are you prepared for that? Harry thought about Mrs. Figg watching from her garden, about Mundungus Fletcher lurking at the end of the street, about 9 years of punishment for displaying the magical abilities that should have been his birthright. He thought about the other children whose signatures glowed on the map, trapped in their own carefully constructed prisons, while the magical world celebrated the hero who had inadvertently caused their suffering. "I'm prepared," Harry said, his voice steady, with the conviction of someone who had finally found adults willing to fight for what was right, rather than what was convenient. "I'm prepared to tell everyone exactly what Dumbledore did to me, and why it was wrong." Ravencroft nodded approvingly. "Good. Because changing a system this entrenched is going to require courage from all of us, especially from you. But I promise you this, Harry Potter. You will never again be at the mercy of people who think they can torture children for the greater good." As magical officials worked around them to coordinate the most comprehensive intervention in international magical law enforcement history, Harry felt something he had never experienced before. The absolute certainty that adults with power were using that power to protect him rather than control him. The boy who had spent 9 years believing he was worthless had become the catalyst for exposing corruption at the highest levels of magical government. The child who had been systematically tortured by people claiming to protect him was about to bring down the very system that had enabled his abuse. And Harry Potter, armed with his father's map and supported by people who genuinely cared about justice, was finally going to have the chance to ensure that no other magical child would suffer as he had suffered. The war between Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore was about to become a war between international justice and a corrupt system that had operated in shadows for far too long. But this time, Harry would not be fighting alone. He had allies with the knowledge, authority, and determination necessary to challenge even the most powerful wizard of the age. And for the first time in his life, Harry Potter was absolutely certain that he was going to win. The safe house where the International Confederation placed Harry was unlike anything he had ever imagined could exist. Located in what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary townhouse in central London, the building's interior had been expanded through space-folding charms to accommodate dozens of rooms across multiple floors that somehow fit within the footprint of a single narrow building. But it was the other children Harry met there that truly opened his eyes to the scope of what Dumbledore and the British magical government had been doing. Luna Lovegood was 8 years old, with silvery hair and enormous grey eyes that seemed to see things others missed. She had been living with relatives in the Scottish Highlands who had been told she was mentally unstable and needed constant supervision to prevent her from harming herself with accidental magic. In reality, Luna possessed an extremely rare form of magical sight that allowed her to perceive magical creatures and phenomena invisible to most wizards. Rather than helping her develop this gift, her watchers had been dosing her food with mild, mind-numbing potions to suppress her abilities, while reporting to Dumbledore about her progress in becoming more normal. Neville Longbottom was Harry's age, but seemed younger due to the confidence-crushing regimen he had endured. His grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, genuinely believed she was helping Neville overcome his magical deficiencies by following Dumbledore's guidance. She had no idea that the suppression charms placed on her grandson were preventing him from accessing magical abilities that rivaled Harry's own. The regular humiliations and failures that had convinced everyone Neville was nearly a squib were actually the result of deliberate magical interference designed to keep him dependent and controllable. Most disturbing of all was Susan Bones, whose Aunt Amelia served as the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Susan had been told that her parents' deaths required her to be kept under protective supervision, but the protection involved binding enchantments that not only suppressed her magic, but also influenced her emotional development to make her more compliant and less likely to question authority. Her aunt had unknowingly participated in her own niece's systematic psychological manipulation while believing she was following necessary security protocols. As Harry listened to their stories during the first days at the safe house, he began to understand that what had happened to him was not an aberration or a unique response to his status as the boy who lived. It was part of a comprehensive program designed to control the magical development of children who might pose challenges to the existing power structure when they reached adulthood. The curse-breakers who worked to remove their binding enchantments were among the most skilled magical practitioners Harry had ever encountered, specialists brought in from around the world to deal with dark magic that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. The removal process was gradual and carefully monitored, as attempting to break such complex enchantments too quickly could cause permanent damage to the victim's magical cause. For Harry, the gradual return of his full magical abilities was like discovering he had been living his entire life with weights tied to his limbs. As each layer of suppression was carefully peeled away, he found himself capable of magical feats that would have been impressive for a trained adult wizard, let alone a 9-year-old child. The Marauder's map, responding to his increased magical capacity, began revealing information that had been hidden even from his previous investigations. The surveillance network around Privet Drive was connected to similar operations, monitoring magical families throughout Britain. Children showing signs of unusual magical ability or independence were systematically identified and subjected to various forms of control, ranging from subtle influence charms to outright suppression bindings. But perhaps most shocking of all, the map revealed that some of the children in the program had not survived the process. 3 names appeared in the map's historical records with notations that made Harry's blood run cold. Timothy Clearwater, age 7, magical suppression failure resulting in core collapse. Miranda Clearwater, age 5, accidental magic incident during binding placement resulted in fatality. Both children had been siblings of Penelope Clearwater, who would have been old enough to attend Hogwarts and had been noted in the records as showing dangerous levels of intellectual curiosity about magical theory. The program had not just been torturing magical children, it had been killing them. Harry shared this discovery with Director Ravencroft during one of their daily briefings, and her reaction confirmed his worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy they were uncovering. "We've been investigating similar deaths in other countries," Ravencroft said grimly, studying the map's revelations about the Clearwater children. Cases where magical children died in what appeared to be accidents, but showed signs of magical interference. We suspected an international conspiracy, but we couldn't prove coordination between different magical governments. She paused, her expression hardening with resolve. "Harry, what you've given us proves that this program has been operating for at least a decade, possibly longer. The number of children who have been subjected to these procedures and the number who may have died as a result could be in the hundreds." The magnitude of the conspiracy was staggering. This was not just about Harry Potter or even the handful of children they had rescued. This was about a systematic program of abuse that had been operating with government sanction for years, claiming lives and destroying the futures of magical children across multiple nations. But as the investigation expanded, so did the resistance to it. The first sign of organized opposition came when several countries abruptly withdrew their representatives from the International Confederation's investigation team. France, Germany, and Italy all cited concerns about interference in sovereign magical affairs, despite having initially supported the intervention. It quickly became apparent that the British magical government was not the only one with secrets to hide. Then came the character assassination attempts. Articles began appearing in magical newspapers around the world, questioning Harry's credibility and mental stability. The Daily Prophet published a series of pieces suggesting that Harry's experiences with the Dursleys had left him delusional and prone to fabricating elaborate fantasies of persecution. Other publications followed suit, painting the rescued children as confused and traumatized individuals whose testimony could not be trusted. Most insidiously, former colleagues and allies of the investigation team began experiencing professional and personal pressure to distance themselves from the case. Funding for the investigation was mysteriously reduced. Key pieces of evidence were challenged on technical grounds. Witnesses who had initially supported the children's accounts began changing their stories or refusing to testify. Harry watched these developments unfold with a mixture of anger and determination that surprised the adults around him. Rather than being discouraged by the opposition, he seemed energized by proof that their investigation was threatening people with enough power to orchestrate such comprehensive resistance. "They're scared," Harry told Ravencroft during one of their strategy sessions. "If what we found wasn't true, they would just ignore us or prove we were wrong. But they're putting tremendous effort into discrediting us, which means they know we're right, and they're desperate to prevent more people from believing us." Harry's analysis proved remarkably astute for someone his age, and it highlighted another consequence of removing his magical suppression. Along with his magical abilities, his intellectual capacity had been artificially limited. Without the bindings that had clouded his thinking for 9 years, Harry displayed a level of strategic intelligence and analytical capability that impressed even experienced investigators. But Harry's greatest contribution to the investigation was not his intelligence or his magical abilities. It was his absolute refusal to be intimidated by the forces arrayed against them. When Rita Skeeter published an article in the Daily Prophet claiming that Harry had been brainwashed by foreign magical governments seeking to destabilize Britain, Harry insisted on giving a public interview to set the record straight. When magical officials attempted to have the rescued children declared mentally incompetent to testify, Harry organized them into a coordinated response that demonstrated their clear thinking and detailed memories. Most significantly, when Dumbledore himself finally broke his silence on the matter, Harry was ready for him. The confrontation came during what was supposed to be a private meeting between Dumbledore and Director Ravencroft, held at the International Confederation offices under strict magical security protocols. Harry was not supposed to be present, but he had learned enough about the building's magical protections to find ways around them, using techniques that his newly unbound abilities made possible. Dumbledore arrived at the meeting, looking every inch the wise and powerful wizard his reputation proclaimed him to be. Tall and imposing in his elaborate robes, with his long silver beard and piercing blue eyes, he commanded immediate respect and attention from everyone present. But Harry, hidden under a combination of concealment charms and his newfound ability to bend light around himself, was able to observe the man who had controlled his life without being detected. What Harry saw was not the benevolent grandfather figure that the magical world revered. What he saw was a consummate political operator who wielded charm, manipulation, and carefully managed displays of disappointment with devastating effectiveness. "Helena," Dumbledore said to Director Ravencroft, his voice carrying exactly the right note of sorrowful concern, "I understand that you believe you are acting in these children's best interests, but I fear you have been manipulated by forces that seek to use their tragic circumstances for political gain." Dumbledore's performance was masterful. He expressed deep concern for the children's welfare while subtly questioning Ravencroft's judgment. He acknowledged that mistakes might have been made, while implying that those mistakes were the result of well-intentioned efforts to protect children from threats that outsiders could not fully understand. Most importantly, he positioned himself as the victim of an unfair attack rather than the architect of a systematic program of abuse. "Professor Dumbledore," Ravencroft replied, her tone carefully professional, "we have extensive evidence of deliberate magical torture applied to these children over a period of years. We have documentation of surveillance operations that violate multiple international treaties. We have proof that magical children have died as a result of procedures implemented under your authority." Dumbledore's response was a lesson in political misdirection that Harry found both fascinating and infuriating to observe. "My dear Helena, I understand how these circumstances might appear troubling to those unfamiliar with the complex realities we face in protecting magical children from the legacy of the recent war. Every decision was made with careful consideration of the greater good and with the full knowledge and consent of the appropriate authorities. If some of our methods seem harsh in hindsight, we must remember that the alternative was leaving these vulnerable children exposed to threats that could have destroyed them entirely. It was a brilliant deflection that acknowledged the evidence while reframing it as unfortunate but necessary protection rather than systematic abuse. Dumbledore was not denying what had been done. He was arguing that it had been justified by circumstances that his accusers did not fully understand. But Harry had heard enough. Dropping his concealment charms, Harry stepped into view of both adults with the calm confidence of someone who had planned this confrontation carefully. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said, his young voice cutting through the older wizard's eloquent justifications, "could you please explain to Director Ravencroft why protecting me from the legacy of the war required magically manipulating my relatives into abusing me?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. Dumbledore's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly as he realized that Harry had not only been present for the conversation, but had been analyzing his arguments with uncomfortable precision. "Harry, my boy," Dumbledore said, his tone shifting to the grandfatherly warmth that had charmed countless witches and wizards over the decades. "I understand that you feel confused and perhaps even angry about some of the decisions that were made regarding your care. But you must understand that these decisions were made by people who care deeply about your welfare and who possess knowledge about threats you have not yet encountered." It was exactly the kind of patronizing dismissal that Harry had expected, and he was ready for it. "Professor," Harry replied, pulling out the Marauder's map and activating it with a gesture that made both adults step back in surprise. "I have knowledge too. I know that Timothy and Miranda Clearwater died during magical procedures that you authorized. I know that Luna Lovegood was being poisoned to suppress her abilities. I know that Neville Longbottom was subjected to enchantments designed to destroy his confidence and make him dependent on authority figures." Harry's voice remained calm and controlled, but his eyes blazed with an intensity that made it clear he was not the confused and traumatized child that Dumbledore's supporters had described in their propaganda. "Most importantly," Harry continued, "I know that none of this was necessary to protect any of us from anything. It was done to control us, to make sure we would never be strong enough or confident enough to challenge your authority when we grew up." The silence that followed Harry's accusation stretched for several long moments, as Dumbledore seemed to struggle for a response that would restore his moral authority. But Harry was not finished. "You want to talk about the greater good, Professor? Then explain to me how murdering magical children serves the greater good. Explain to me how torturing them serves the greater good. Explain to me how lying to their families and manipulating their guardian serves the greater good." Each question hit Dumbledore like a physical blow, and Harry could see the older wizard's famous composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of accusations that could not be deflected or reframed. "Harry," Dumbledore said finally, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been genuine regret. "There are aspects of this situation that you are too young to understand. Decisions that seem cruel or unnecessary from your perspective were made to prevent outcomes far worse than anything you have experienced." It was the wrong thing to say to a 9-year-old who had just spent weeks discovering the true scope of his own victimization and that of other children. "I understand perfectly, Professor," Harry replied, his voice now carrying the cold authority of someone who had seen through comfortable lies and refused to pretend otherwise. "I understand that you decided my life was less important than your political goals. I understand that you decided Luna's sanity was less important than your need to control her abilities. I understand that you decided Timothy and Miranda Clearwater's lives were acceptable losses in your campaign to prevent magical children from growing up strong enough to oppose you." Harry stepped closer to Dumbledore, and despite the vast difference in their ages and magical training, it was the older wizard who seemed diminished by the confrontation. "What I don't understand, Professor, is why you thought you could get away with it forever. Did you really believe that none of us would ever discover what you had done? Did you really think that the magical world would continue to trust you once they learned the truth about how you treat the children in your care? The question hung in the air between them, and Harry could see that Dumbledore had no answer that would satisfy anyone, least of all himself. The man who had been revered as the greatest wizard of the age had been brought low by a 9-year-old boy, armed with nothing more than the truth and the absolute refusal to let anyone convince him that his suffering had been justified. Harry Potter had won his first direct confrontation with Albus Dumbledore, and both of them knew that the war between them had only just begun. But Harry also knew something else. He was no longer fighting this war alone. He had allies, evidence, and most importantly, he had the unshakable conviction that he was fighting for something more important than his own freedom. He was fighting to ensure that no other magical child would ever suffer as he had suffered, and that was a cause worth any sacrifice. The fallout from Harry's confrontation with Dumbledore was immediate and far-reaching. Within hours of the meeting, emergency sessions were being called in magical governments around the world as the full implications of what had been revealed began to sink in. The man who had been considered the moral authority of the magical world had been publicly exposed as someone who tortured children for political purposes, and no amount of spin or damage control could make that reality disappear. But Harry quickly learned that exposing corruption and actually eliminating it were two very different challenges. The International Confederation's investigation had provided overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse, rescued dozens of children from ongoing torture, and demonstrated that the conspiracy extended far beyond Britain's borders. Yet the magical establishments in multiple countries were proving remarkably resistant to meaningful reform, preferring instead to treat the revelations as an isolated scandal that could be contained through selective prosecutions and cosmetic policy changes. Director Ravencroft called it institutional inertia, the tendency of large organizations to protect themselves even when confronted with evidence of their own wrongdoing. Harry called it cowardice, the unwillingness of people in positions of power to admit that they had allowed children to be tortured on their watch. The resistance took many forms, from legal challenges that tied up evidence in procedural disputes to coordinated media campaigns that continued to question the credibility of the rescued children. Most frustrating of all were the good people within the magical establishment, who privately acknowledged that horrible things had been done, but insisted that working for gradual change from within the system was more practical than demanding immediate justice. Harry had no patience for gradual change or working within systems that had demonstrated their willingness to torture children. His confrontation with Dumbledore had crystallized something in his thinking that made compromise impossible. Either the magical world would commit to protecting its children properly, or he would find ways to protect them himself. The opportunity for independent action came when Grintock, the goblin account manager at Gringotts Bank, requested a private meeting with Harry to discuss his family's financial holdings. The meeting, arranged through the International Confederation's legal team, was ostensibly about ensuring that Harry's newfound independence would be supported by proper access to his inheritance. But Grintock had additional information that would transform Harry's understanding of his options. "Mr. Potter," Grintock said, as they settled into a heavily warded conference room deep within the bank's most secure levels. "Your parents were far more prepared for the possibility of your orphaning than most people realize. They established multiple financial instruments and legal arrangements designed to protect your interests in the event that the magical authorities failed in their duty of care." The goblin's sharp teeth gleamed in what might have been a smile as he spread documents across the table between them. "Your father, in particular, seemed to anticipate the possibility that powerful magical individuals might attempt to manipulate your circumstances for their own purposes. He created what amounts to a comprehensive escape plan, complete with financial resources, legal protections, and international connections that operate entirely outside the control of any single magical government." Harry studied the documents with growing amazement and gratitude for parents he had never known, but who had somehow anticipated the exact situation he found himself facing. James and Lily Potter had not simply left him money. They had left him the tools necessary to build an independent life, free from the control of anyone who might view him as a political asset rather than a person. The financial resources alone were staggering. In addition to the vault at Gringotts that Harry had known about, his parents had established accounts with goblin banks in 17 different countries, each containing enough funds to support a comfortable life indefinitely. They had also invested in Muggle financial markets through magical intermediaries, creating a portfolio of assets that had grown considerably during the years of Harry's imprisonment. But the legal arrangements were even more significant than the money. James and Lily had worked with goblin lawyers to create citizenship documents for Harry in multiple magical communities that would allow him to travel freely without requiring permission from British magical authorities. They had established relationships with magical schools in other countries that would accept Harry as a student regardless of his political circumstances in Britain. Most importantly, they had created legal frameworks that would allow Harry to access these resources and protections automatically upon reaching a certain age or upon meeting specific conditions that clearly anticipated his current situation. "Your parents," Grintock explained, "were particularly concerned about the possibility that you might be placed in circumstances designed to keep you weak and dependent until you reached an age where you could be more directly controlled. They created triggers within these arrangements that would activate if evidence emerged of systematic abuse or magical suppression being applied to you." Harry felt a surge of emotion that was part gratitude and part grief for the parents who had loved him enough to protect him from dangers they would not live to see him face. James and Lily Potter had given their son not just money and legal protections, but the knowledge that he was valued and cherished by people who had believed he deserved freedom and autonomy, rather than manipulation and control. But perhaps the most valuable thing his parents had left him was a network of international contacts who had been waiting for years to help him when he was ready to claim his independence. The list of names Grintock provided read like a directory of the most influential independent magical practitioners in the world. Cursebreakers who specialized in removing dark magic, healers who could reverse the effects of long-term magical suppression, educators who ran alternative magical schools for children whose circumstances made traditional education impossible, legal advocates who fought for magical children's rights in international courts. All of them had known James and Lily Potter personally. All of them had agreed to help their son when he needed them, and all of them operated outside the political structures that had enabled his abuse. "Mr. Potter," Grintock concluded, "your parents essentially created a shadow support network designed to ensure that you would never be dependent on the goodwill of magical authorities who might have interests that conflicted with your welfare. With your permission, I can begin activating these arrangements immediately." Harry's decision was immediate and absolute. "Do it. I want access to everything my parents left for me, and I want to start building connections with people who are committed to protecting magical children rather than exploiting them." The activation of James and Lily Potter's contingency plans moved with the precision and efficiency that characterized all Goblin financial operations. Within days, Harry found himself in communication with magical practitioners from around the world who had been waiting nearly a decade to fulfill promises made to his parents. Antonia Rossetti, a cursebreaker based in Rome, had worked with James Potter during their training years and had never forgotten his request to help his son if magical suppression was ever detected. She arrived in London within hours of being contacted, bringing with her a team of specialists who could not only remove the remaining traces of Harry's binding enchantments, but also teach him to recognize and counter such magic if it was ever used against him again. Marcus Zimmermann ran a small magical school in the Swiss Alps that specialized in providing education for children whose circumstances made traditional magical schooling impossible. Students included young curse breakers whose families had been targeted by dark wizards, children of magical researchers whose work required constant travel, and refugees from magical conflicts who needed education that could adapt to uncertain living situations. He offered Harry not just a place to continue his magical education, but a community of students who understood what it meant to live outside conventional magical society. Most significantly, Elena Vasquez was a legal advocate who specialized in magical children's rights cases before international courts. She had been working for years to expose and prosecute the kind of systematic abuse that Harry had experienced, and she had been waiting for a case with sufficient evidence and international attention to force comprehensive reforms. "Harry," she told him during their first conversation via magical communication, "your case has given us the leverage we need to pursue prosecutions not just of individual officials, but of the entire system that enabled these crimes. But such prosecutions require witnesses who are willing to testify publicly and to endure the inevitable attempts to discredit and intimidate them." Harry's response was immediate. "I'll testify. I'll do whatever is necessary to make sure this never happens to other children." Elena's smile was fierce with anticipation. "Good, because we're going to pursue charges of crimes against magical humanity. We're going to demand extradition of officials from multiple countries, and we're going to use every piece of evidence your parents' map has provided to prove that this conspiracy reaches the highest levels of magical government in half a dozen nations." As Harry began working with his new network of allies, he discovered that his confrontation with Dumbledore had inspired other victims of magical authority abuse to come forward. Children who had been subjected to memory modifications to cover up accidents caused by institutional negligence. Young magical practitioners whose abilities had been suppressed because they developed in ways that made authorities uncomfortable. Even adult wizards and witches who had been marginalized or persecuted for questioning official policies began reaching out with their stories. The movement that had begun with Harry's discovery of the Marauder's map was becoming something much larger, a comprehensive challenge to the systems of control and manipulation that characterized magical government in the modern era. But Harry's most significant contribution to this growing movement was not his testimony or his evidence. It was his absolute refusal to accept the comfortable compromises that would have allowed the magical establishment to minimize their accountability while making token gestures toward reform. When the British Ministry of Magic offered to implement new oversight procedures for magical children's welfare in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecutions, Harry rejected the deal publicly and demanded full accountability for past crimes. When the International Confederation of Wizards proposed a truth and reconciliation process that would grant amnesty to officials who admitted their mistakes, Harry insisted that such processes only made sense after justice had been served and reforms had been proven effective. When Dumbledore himself, through intermediaries, suggested a private meeting to discuss how Harry's legitimate concerns could be addressed through institutional changes, Harry responded by releasing additional evidence of the conspiracy that made clear he had no interest in negotiations with people who had tortured children. Harry's uncompromising stance frustrated even some of his allies, who worried that demanding too much too quickly might result in getting nothing at all. But Harry had learned something during his years of imprisonment that his well-meaning supporters sometimes forgot. When dealing with people who were willing to torture children, compromise was not justice, but complicity. The test of Harry's resolve came when the magical establishments began to push back with serious consequences for his intransigence. Britain formally revoked Harry's citizenship and declared him a fugitive from magical justice, claiming that his refusal to cooperate with official investigations proved he was being manipulated by hostile foreign powers. France, Germany, and Italy followed suit, making it clear that Harry would not be welcome in large portions of magical Europe. More seriously, several of the children who had been rescued from the suppression program began facing pressure to repudiate their testimony. Neville Longbottom's grandmother was told that his continued association with Harry's extremist activities would result in the family losing their seats on the Wizengamot. Luna Lovegood's relatives were warned that harboring a fugitive could result in criminal charges against them. Most painfully for Harry, some of the children began to waver under the pressure. Susan Bones whose aunt worked within the magical law enforcement system, started suggesting that perhaps they should work with the authorities rather than against them. Two of the younger children decided they wanted to return to their families rather than face an uncertain future as political refugees. Harry understood their decisions and felt no anger toward children who had endured enough trauma without being forced to fight a political battle they had not chosen. But their departures made clear that the war he was fighting would exact costs from people he cared about, and that victory would require sacrifices that even his allies might not be willing to make. The lowest point came when Emmeline Vance, the kind witch who had first helped Harry in the leaky cauldron, was arrested by British magical authorities on charges of kidnapping and corrupting the morals of magical minors. The woman who had risked her career and freedom to help Harry expose the truth about his abuse was being prosecuted as a criminal by the same system that had enabled that abuse. Harry's response to Emmeline's arrest was swift and decisive. Rather than allowing her to become another victim of the magical establishment's attempts to silence opposition, he used his parents' resources to hire the best magical legal team available and launched a coordinated media campaign that made Emmeline's prosecution a test case for the entire international magical community's commitment to justice. But more importantly, Harry used the arrest as an opportunity to demonstrate that he was not merely a victim seeking redress for past wrongs. He was someone prepared to fight for anyone who stood up for magical children's rights, regardless of the personal cost. The magical world had spent months trying to discredit, intimidate, and silence Harry Potter. They were about to discover that their efforts had only strengthened his resolve and expanded his influence. The boy who had been imprisoned by people claiming to protect him had become a young man committed to ensuring that such protection never again served as an excuse for abuse. And Harry Potter, armed with his parents' resources and allied with people who shared his commitment to justice, was about to show the magical world what happened when someone refused to accept that children's suffering was an acceptable price for political stability. The war between Harry Potter and the magical establishment was entering a new phase, one where the stakes would be measured not in individual freedom, but in the fundamental question of whether magical society was capable of reform or would need to be replaced entirely. Harry had already proven he could survive their attempts to destroy him. Now he was going to prove he could destroy them in return, not through violence or revenge, but through the simple power of refusing to let them hide their crimes behind comfortable lies about necessity and the greater good. The magical world had created Harry Potter through their abuse and neglect. They were about to discover that they had created exactly the kind of enemy they had been trying to prevent. Someone with the knowledge, resources, and absolute determination necessary to hold them accountable for everything they had done. The months following Harry's public break with the magical establishment transformed him from a rescued victim into something far more dangerous to the existing order. A symbol of resistance that other oppressed magical individuals could rally around. But symbols, Harry learned, required more than just moral authority and righteous anger to create lasting change. They required networks, resources, and the kind of institutional knowledge that could only come from people who had been fighting these battles long before Harry Potter became a name that magical governments whispered with concern. The safe house where Harry had initially been placed had evolved into something resembling a small magical embassy, with representatives from dozens of international organizations arriving daily to offer support, resources, and strategic advice. But it was the arrival of a group Harry had never expected that marked the beginning of his real education in magical resistance. The delegation from the Goblin nations arrived without fanfare or official announcement, their presence detected only when the safe house's protective wards began registering magical signatures that predated most human magical traditions by several millennia. Grintock had arranged the meeting, but even he seemed surprised by the seniority and number of goblin officials who chose to attend. Chieftain Ragnarok himself led the delegation, a goblin whose authority extended far beyond the banking operations that most wizards associated with goblin society. The goblins Harry learned during that first meeting, had been watching the systematic abuse of magical children with growing concern, not just because it violated international law, but because it represented exactly the kind of human magical arrogance that had led to centuries of conflict between goblin and wizard societies. "Mr. Potter," Chieftain Ragnok said, in heavily accented but perfect English, "your parents understood something that most human magical practitioners refuse to acknowledge, that the wizarding world's problems stem not from external threats, but from internal corruption that treats power as a right rather than a responsibility." The goblins had been documenting human magical rights violations for decades, building comprehensive files on everything from the systematic marginalization of magical creatures to the abuse of wizarding authority in non-magical communities. But they had lacked both the legal standing and the political leverage necessary to challenge these practices through official channels. Harry's case changed that calculation completely. "The torture of magical children," Ragnok continued, "violates not only human magical law, but also the ancient treaties that govern relationships between magical species. When human governments systematically abuse their own young, they forfeit the moral authority necessary to negotiate with other magical peoples as equals." The implications were staggering. The goblin nations were not simply offering to support Harry's legal challenges. They were proposing to withdraw from the treaty relationships that had governed magical banking, commerce, and diplomacy for centuries, effectively declaring the human magical governments illegitimate until meaningful reforms were implemented. But perhaps even more significantly, they were offering Harry access to resources and knowledge that no human magical practitioner possessed. The goblins had been fighting for rights and recognition within magical society for over 1,000 years. They understood better than anyone how to challenge entrenched power structures, how to coordinate resistance across multiple jurisdictions, and how to apply economic and political pressure in ways that could not be ignored or deflected through conventional magical politics. Within days of the goblin delegation's arrival, Harry found himself attending strategy sessions that included not just legal advocates and curse breakers, but experts in magical economics, international relations, and the kind of political warfare that operated far below the level of public awareness. The goblins introduced Harry to representatives of other marginalized magical communities who had been organizing for decades, but had lacked the visibility and political leverage necessary to force meaningful change. House elves who had been working for generations to establish legal protections for magical servants, centaur tribes who had been fighting to prevent the destruction of their territories by expanding magical settlements, even vampire and werewolf communities who had been systematically excluded from magical society, despite their obvious magical abilities. All of them had been waiting for an opportunity to challenge the human magical establishment's monopoly on political and legal authority. Harry's case provided exactly such an opportunity because it demonstrated that even the most privileged human magical children were not safe from the corruption and abuse that characterized magical government in the modern era. "If they will torture Harry Potter," said Firenze, a young centaur who served as liaison between the tribes and various magical rights organizations, "then no magical being can trust them to honor any agreement or respect any boundary. The systematic abuse of children is not a policy disagreement that can be resolved through negotiation. It is a fundamental moral failing that delegitimizes their claim to leadership." The coalition that began forming around Harry's case was unlike anything the magical world had seen since the goblin rebellions of the 18th century. But unlike those earlier conflicts, which had been characterized by violence and mutual destruction, this movement was committed to achieving change through legal and political means that would create lasting reforms rather than temporary victories. Harry's role in this coalition was both symbolic and practical. As the most visible victim of magical government abuse, he provided the public face that could generate media attention and political pressure. But as someone with access to unique magical resources and international connections, he also served as a coordinator and strategic planner whose decisions could affect the entire movement. The responsibility was overwhelming for someone who had recently celebrated his 10th birthday, but Harry found himself rising to meet challenges that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. His experiences with the Dursleys had taught him to think strategically about survival in hostile environments. His discovery of the magical world had given him knowledge of resources and opportunities that most magical children never encountered. Most importantly, his exposure to systematic abuse had given him an understanding of injustice that motivated him to work harder and sacrifice more than might have been expected from someone his age. The first major test of the Coalition's effectiveness came when the British Ministry of Magic attempted to freeze all goblin-managed assets belonging to Harry Potter and the other rescued children. The move was clearly intended to cut off funding for their legal challenges, while demonstrating that continued resistance would result in escalating consequences for anyone who supported them. The goblin response was swift, coordinated, and devastating to magical commerce throughout Europe. Within hours of the asset freeze order, goblin-managed banks in 17 countries simultaneously declared a moratorium on all transactions involving British magical currency. Wizarding businesses found themselves unable to access funds, process payments, or conduct international trade. The magical stock market collapsed as investors realized that the stability of the entire monetary system depended on goblin cooperation that could no longer be taken for granted. But the goblins did not stop with financial warfare. They also began demanding immediate renegotiation of every treaty and agreement that governed magical commerce, using their economic leverage to force discussions about issues that magical governments had been avoiding for decades. Within a week, the British ministry found itself facing not just a financial crisis, but a comprehensive challenge to their authority that threatened to spread to magical governments worldwide. The attempt to intimidate Harry through economic pressure had backfired spectacularly, demonstrating that the coalition supporting him possessed both the unity and the resources necessary to fight back effectively. Harry watched these developments unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sobering awareness of the forces he had set in motion. The magical world was discovering that their treatment of magical children had consequences that extended far beyond the children themselves. Every magical government that had participated in or tolerated systematic abuse now found themselves facing organized resistance from communities they had marginalized or ignored for centuries. But the coalition's success also brought new challenges and responsibilities that tested Harry's growing leadership abilities. The first challenge was managing the expectations and demands of allies whose goals sometimes conflicted with Harry's primary focus on protecting magical children. The house elves wanted comprehensive labor protections that would fundamentally alter their relationships with wizarding families. The centaurs demanded autonomous territories that would be permanently protected from magical development. The vampires and werewolves sought full citizenship rights that would require magical societies to completely reconsider their approaches to magical creatures. All of these goals were legitimate and justified, but pursuing them simultaneously threatened to dilute the coalition's focus and provide opportunities for their opponents to divide them through selective concessions. Harry's solution demonstrated a political sophistication that surprised even his most experienced advisors. Rather than trying to negotiate between conflicting priorities, he proposed a comprehensive framework that linked all of their goals together under a single principle: the right of all magical beings to self-determination, free from arbitrary authority. "We're not fighting separate battles that happen to be taking place at the same time," Harry explained during a coalition planning session that included representatives from every major magical rights organization in Europe. "We're fighting one battle against a system that treats power as a license to abuse anyone who cannot effectively resist. Whether that abuse targets magical children, house elves, centaurs, or any other group is less important than the fact that it represents the same fundamental corruption of authority." The framework Harry proposed would pursue legal challenges and political reforms that established universal principles rather than group-specific protections. Instead of demanding special rights for magical children, They would demand legal frameworks that protected all magical beings from government abuse. Instead of seeking privileges for particular magical creatures, they would seek recognition of universal magical rights that applied regardless of species or social status. The approach was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible, but it had the crucial advantage of preventing their opponents from dividing the coalition through partial concessions or targeted compromises. The second major challenge was managing the international scope of what they were attempting. As magical governments in multiple countries began facing similar coalitions demanding similar reforms, the movement threatened to destabilize magical society across the globe simultaneously. Some of Harry's advisors began suggesting that perhaps they should focus on achieving reforms in one or two countries before attempting to challenge the entire international magical order. But Harry had learned enough about institutional resistance to understand that partial reforms in isolated jurisdictions would be vulnerable to reversal as soon as political circumstances changed. If we don't challenge the whole system, Harry argued, then the parts we don't challenge will always be working to undermine the parts we do change. Dumbledore and the other officials who authorized these programs have resources and connections that extend across multiple countries. The only way to ensure lasting change is to make sure they can't simply move their operations to friendlier jurisdictions when we start winning in particular locations. Harry's analysis proved prescient when intelligence gathered by Goblin financial networks revealed that several magical governments were indeed discussing contingency plans for relocating sensitive operations to countries where magical rights protections were weaker or non-existent. The discovery led to the coalition's most ambitious undertaking, a coordinated legal challenge filed simultaneously in the International Court of Magical Justice, the Goblin High Court, and the tribal councils of every major magical creature community. The challenge sought not just prosecution of individual officials, but a fundamental restructuring of international magical law to establish enforceable protections for all magical beings. Harry's personal testimony formed the centerpiece of the legal case, but it was supported by documentation and witness statements from hundreds of other victims whose cases had been uncovered as the investigation expanded. The systematic nature of the abuse, the coordination between different magical governments, and the involvement of respected officials like Dumbledore made it impossible for magical authorities to dismiss the challenge as an isolated incident or a politically motivated attack. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of the case was Harry's refusal to seek personal compensation or special treatment. Throughout months of legal proceedings, media interviews, and political negotiations, he consistently demanded only one thing: comprehensive reforms that would prevent other magical children from experiencing what he had experienced. "I don't want apologies or compensation," Harry told the International Court during his formal testimony. "I want systems that make it impossible for magical authorities to torture children ever again. I want legal protections that cannot be waived or suspended for any reason. I want accountability mechanisms that ensure officials who abuse their authority face consequences regardless of their political connections or reputation." The courtroom was silent as Harry continued, his young voice carrying an authority that made seasoned legal practitioners lean forward to catch every word. "Most importantly, I want every magical child to know that they have rights that adults must respect, that they have protections that cannot be taken away, and that if those rights and protections are violated, there are people who will fight for them regardless of how powerful their abusers might be." It was a statement that captured not just Harry's personal demands, but the entire coalition's vision of what magical society could become if it chose justice over convenience and protection over control. The magical world had spent months trying to contain and minimize the challenge that Harry Potter represented. They were beginning to realize that they had failed completely, and that the boy who had once been their victim had become the architect of changes that would reshape magical society for generations to come. Harry Potter had started his fight seeking freedom from the people who had imprisoned him. He was ending it by offering that same freedom to every magical being who had ever suffered under systems that prioritized the comfort of the powerful over the rights of the vulnerable. The war between Harry Potter and magical authority was about to become a revolution that would determine whether magical society was capable of reform or deserved to be replaced by something better. The magical world's response to the coordinated legal challenges filed by Harry's coalition was swift, desperate, and ultimately self-defeating. Within weeks of the International Court of Magical Justice accepting the case for review, magical governments across Europe began implementing emergency measures that revealed the true scope of their panic about losing control over the narrative surrounding magical children's rights. The first sign of organized resistance came when several countries simultaneously passed new laws restricting international magical travel for minors without specific governmental approval. Ostensibly designed to protect magical children from being influenced by foreign extremist groups, the laws had the obvious practical effect of preventing other abused magical children from reaching the safe houses and legal support networks that Harry's coalition had established. But the travel restrictions were only the beginning of a coordinated campaign to isolate Harry and his supporters while discrediting their claims through increasingly desperate propaganda efforts. The Daily Prophet published a series of articles suggesting that Harry had been brainwashed by goblin separatists seeking to destabilize human magical society. The German magical newspaper, Der Zauberspiegel, ran stories claiming that the rescued children were being held against their will by international criminals who were using them to justify attacks on legitimate magical authority. Even publications in countries that had initially supported the investigation began running pieces questioning whether the coalition's demands were reasonable or represented dangerous extremism that threatened magical society's stability. Most insidiously, several magical governments began releasing carefully selected documents that appeared to justify their past actions, while omitting crucial context about the systematic nature of the abuse. They published correspondence showing officials expressing genuine concern about magical children's welfare while concealing the binding enchantments and surveillance operations that constituted the actual violations. They released medical reports documenting the care provided to children in the suppression program, while hiding the psychological evaluations that revealed the trauma those children had experienced. Harry watched these developments with a mixture of anger and strategic calculation that had become characteristic of his approach to dealing with institutional dishonesty. Each new attempt to discredit the coalition provided additional evidence of the magical establishment's willingness to lie, manipulate, and abuse their authority to protect themselves from accountability. But more importantly, the increasingly desperate nature of their propaganda efforts suggested that the coalition's legal and political pressure was having real effects that magical authorities were struggling to counter through legitimate means. The confirmation of this assessment came when Luna Lovegood's father approached Harry with information that fundamentally changed their understanding of what they were fighting against. Xenophilius Lovegood had been investigating conspiracy theories involving magical government corruption for years, though most people dismissed his work as the eccentric fantasies of someone whose grip on reality had been damaged by his wife's death. But Luna's rescue from the suppression program had given her father access to evidence and testimony that transformed his scattered theories into a comprehensive understanding of how magical authority operated behind the facade of democratic governance. "Harry," Xenophilius said during a clandestine meeting arranged through goblin intermediaries, "what happened to you and Luna and the other children is not an aberration or a policy mistake. It's part of a systematic program that has been operating for decades to ensure that magical society remains under the control of a relatively small group of officials and their allies." The documentation that Xenophilius had assembled told a story that was even more disturbing than what Harry had already discovered. The suppression program was indeed systematic, but it was also highly selective in ways that revealed its true purpose. Children who showed signs of exceptional magical ability were targeted not because their power was dangerous, but because powerful magical individuals posed potential challenges to existing authority structures. Children whose families had histories of political independence or resistance to magical government policies found themselves subjected to interventions that ensured they would grow up dependent on official approval and support. Most significantly, the program specifically targeted children whose magical development suggested they might be capable of detecting or countering the kinds of manipulation and control that magical authorities routinely used to maintain their power. They weren't just torturing you to keep you weak, Xenophilius explained, as Harry studied documents that traced the suppression program back nearly 50 years. They were torturing you because your particular combination of magical abilities and family background made you exactly the kind of person who could expose and resist the systems they use to control everyone else. The revelation recontextualized everything Harry thought he understood about his own case and the broader conspiracy they were fighting. This was not simply about protecting magical children from abuse. This was about challenging a system of magical governance that was fundamentally based on the manipulation and control of magical society as a whole. The evidence Xenophilius provided showed that magical governments routinely used memory modifications on their own citizens to manage public opinion about controversial policies. They employed surveillance and influence operations that extended far beyond the magical world into non-magical communities where they could affect political and economic decisions. Most disturbing of all, they had been systematically identifying and neutralizing potential sources of resistance to their authority for generations, using techniques that ranged from subtle career sabotage to the kind of outright abuse that Harry and the other children had experienced. Harry realized that his fight for magical children's rights had inadvertently exposed something much larger, a comprehensive system of authoritarian control disguised as democratic magical governance. The implications were staggering and terrifying. If Xenophilius was correct, then every magical government in Europe was essentially an authoritarian regime that maintained power through systematic manipulation of their citizens' minds, memories, and magical development. The democratic institutions and legal protections that magical society claimed to possess were elaborate facades designed to conceal systems of control that would have been recognizable to any historical dictator. But the revelation also explained why the coalition's legal challenges had triggered such desperate resistance from magical authorities. Harry and his allies were not just demanding justice for abused children. They were inadvertently threatening to expose and dismantle the entire foundation upon which modern magical society was built. "What do we do with this information?" Harry asked Xenophilius, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with knowledge that could destabilize civilization itself. "We tell the truth," Xenophilius replied, with the calm certainty of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. "We present this evidence to the International Court and let magical society decide whether they want to continue living under systems that treat them as subjects to be manipulated rather than citizens with rights to be respected." The decision to expand their legal case to include Xenophilius's evidence was not made lightly. Harry and his advisors spent weeks debating whether exposing the full scope of magical government corruption would help their cause or provide their opponents with opportunities to dismiss them as dangerous extremists seeking to destroy magical society entirely. The debate was resolved when several more magical children came forward with stories that corroborated Xenophilius's research in ways that could not be ignored or explained away. Cho Chang, a 12-year-old whose family had immigrated to Britain from Hong Kong, revealed that she had been subjected to memory modifications that were designed not just to suppress traumatic experiences, but to alter her personality in ways that made her more compliant and less likely to question authority. The modifications had been performed by St. Mungo's hospital staff, who told her parents they were treating the psychological effects of her accidental magic incidents. Terry Boot, whose parents were both magical researchers, described a program of surveillance and interference that had extended to his family's professional work. His parents' research into alternative magical education methods had been systematically sabotaged through funding cuts, professional ostracism, and regulatory obstacles that appeared to be random bureaucratic problems but actually constituted coordinated efforts to prevent them from developing educational approaches that might make magical children more independent and self-reliant. Most damning of all, Dean Thomas revealed that his adoption by a non-magical family had not been the result of unfortunate circumstances, but had been deliberately arranged by magical authorities who wanted to study the effects of magical suppression in non-magical environments. His entire life had been an experiment designed to test whether magical children raised without any knowledge of their heritage could be more easily controlled when they were eventually introduced to magical society. The pattern that emerged from these testimonies was unambiguous. Magical governments were not simply failing to protect magical children from abuse. They were systematically creating conditions that would ensure those children grew up as controllable subjects rather than independent magical practitioners capable of challenging authority. Harry's coalition expanded their legal filing to include comprehensive documentation of what they termed systematic magical authoritarianism, a coordinated program of control and manipulation that violated not just magical children's rights, but the fundamental principles of democratic governance and individual autonomy that magical society claimed to uphold. The response to this expanded challenge was immediate and revealed the true nature of what they were fighting against. Rather than defending their policies through legal arguments or evidence, magical governments across Europe began implementing what amounted to martial law in magical communities. Emergency powers were declared that suspended normal legal protections and allowed magical authorities to detain, interrogate, and modify the memories of anyone suspected of supporting dangerous extremist activities. Harry Potter and his known allies were declared enemies of magical society and subject to immediate arrest on sight. Rewards were offered for information leading to their capture. Most ominously, new laws were passed that made it a crime to possess, distribute, or discuss any materials related to the legal challenges or the evidence supporting them. The mask had finally come off. Faced with exposure of their authoritarian control systems, magical governments had abandoned any pretense of democratic governance and revealed themselves as exactly the kind of despotic regimes that Harry's evidence had suggested they were. But the magical establishment's transition to open authoritarianism also provided the coalition with exactly the kind of proof they needed to demonstrate the legitimacy of their claims to anyone still harboring doubts about the nature of magical governance. "They're not even trying to pretend anymore," Harry observed during a strategy session held in a heavily warded location that even the goblins' most sophisticated detection methods couldn't pinpoint. "They've basically admitted that everything we've accused them of is true by responding to our legal challenges with martial law and censorship." The coalition's response to magical martial law demonstrated the effectiveness of the network Harry had spent months building. Rather than being intimidated into submission, magical rights organizations across the globe coordinated a campaign of resistance that revealed the international scope of both the problem and the opposition to it. Goblin financial networks ensured that magical commerce ground to a halt as banks refused to process transactions for governments that had declared emergency powers. House elf communities began organized work stoppages that crippled magical households and businesses throughout Europe. Centaur tribes closed their territories to magical authorities and declared autonomous zones where refugees from magical government persecution could find sanctuary. Most significantly, magical practitioners who had previously remained neutral began choosing sides as the implications of magical authoritarianism became impossible to ignore. Healers refused to perform memory modifications or magical suppression procedures. Teachers resigned from magical schools rather than implement curricula designed to produce compliant rather than educated students. Even some magical law enforcement officials began defecting to join the coalition after being ordered to arrest magical children for the crime of testifying about their own abuse. The magical world was fracturing along lines that had been building for decades, but had remained hidden beneath the surface of apparent democratic governance. Harry Potter's fight for freedom from his own abuse had become a catalyst for a comprehensive reckoning with the authoritarian foundations of magical society itself. As magical governments escalated their oppression in desperate attempts to maintain control, they only succeeded in proving that the Coalition's accusations were not just accurate, but actually understated the scope of the problem. The boy who had been tortured for displaying magical abilities was about to bring down the entire system that had enabled that torture, not through violence or revenge, but through the simple act of telling the truth and refusing to accept that his suffering had been justified by any greater good. Harry Potter had begun his fight seeking justice for himself and other abused magical children. He was ending it by offering liberation from authoritarian control to every magical being who had ever lived under systems that treated freedom as a privilege to be granted rather than a right to be protected. The war between Harry Potter and magical authority had become a revolution that would determine whether magical society deserved to survive in its current form or needed to be rebuilt from the ground up according to principles that actually protected the rights and dignity of all magical beings. And as magical governments revealed their true authoritarian nature through their desperate attempts to suppress the truth, they were ensuring that when the revolution succeeded, there would be no possibility of returning to the comfortable lies that had enabled their crimes for so many generations. The magical world had created its own destruction through decades of abuse and corruption. Harry Potter had simply provided the catalyst that made their self-destruction inevitable and ensured that something better would emerge from the ruins of what they had built.